Good afternoon. Oh, y'all can do better than that. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Ron Daniels, president of the Institute of the Black World 21st Century and convener of the National African American Reparations Commission. And I'm welcoming you to this historic Juneteenth forum, Healing and Reconciliation, HR 40 and the Promise of Reparations for African Americans. Broadcast live on WPFW 89.3 in Washington, D.C. WBAI 99.5 FM in New York, streaming live via the ACLU website, the IBW website, Live Free Network with Faith in Action, and the University of the West Indies Television. The University of the West Indies is in the house. What a glorious day. We could find no better place to gather than in this historic church, the Metropolitan AME Church. An AME church, the denomination founded by the great institution builder Richard Allen in the face of white supremacy and racial exclusion. To welcome you, it is my honor to bring to the rostrum the leader of this great faith institution, the Reverend Dr. William Lamar. Please welcome him.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I invite you to call this name with me. Would you say with me the name Belinda?
Belinda.
Belinda is our ancestor who sued in Massachusetts upon the death of her owner for a pension for herself and her daughter. Her argument was that the owner's wealth was built on the labor of Belinda and her daughter, and at his demise, it was only right for his estate to compensate her for her labor. We come today because we stand on the shoulders of many Belindas, of many who knew that the condition of their servitude was neither the will of God nor the proper status of any human being. So before we go any further, I would invite you in this holy place to call out the names of our ancestors upon whose shoulders we stand. Would you call out the names of our ancestors?
Nat Turner.
Mario Videlli.
Free Mother.
Chokwe Lumumba. Reparations from Jenkins. Free Mother Moore.
Amos Wilson.
Lewis.
Sojourner Truth.
Kalonji Olusegun.
Harriet
Marilyn
Tubman.
Killingham.
Sojourner Truth. Callie House.
Those have been called out. Saint called.
Ulysses Howard. Audrey Howard.
Our ancestors are with us. God is with us.
Ashe.
We are together.
Ashe.
We are together because we live in the United States of amnesia. We are together because America has never been a fan of history, always hagiography, the making of saints out of great sinners. The difficulty that we have in this nation is that we believe we say impersonal responsibility for others, but not impersonal responsibility for those who created and sustained the United States empire on the backs of the labor of African, by conquering the lands of First Nations people, and by covering up these crimes in vacuous terms like freedom, liberty, equality, and justice. We are here because we know that lies will never get us to truth. We are here because we know that justice is never the offspring of injustice. But we've come together to learn. We've come together to enjoy space together, but we've also come together because there is a fight before us. Please know that Mr. Lincoln did not free anyone, but we freed ourselves. by putting pressure on systems that were unjust. Please know that Mr. Johnson might have signed a bill, but women in churches who sold dinners and nameless and countless people are the ones that made civil rights, or what approximates as civil rights, possible in this land. And so we come today to learn and to grow so that we can leave this place and fight. Because never, ever, ever, ever believe that what we earn will eternally be ours. But the clock of injustice and those who fight to return America back to its stasis always seek to keep things as they were and are. You've got the Civil Rights Act, but just a few moments ago, Mr. Chief Justice gutted pre-clearance to make it difficult for people who are Black to vote. Reconstruction is the story of redemption of white supremacists taking back what they felt like was theirs, and even the story of America's founding. If you will read Counter-Revolution of 1776, America was not founded as a place of freedom or justice, but the colonists seceded because Britain was moving away from slavery and they wanted to maintain their kleptocratic slavocracy. If we want freedom, we've got to talk truthfully one to another. If we want freedom, we must be reminded that every institution in America, the banking institution, the insurance institutions, the institutions of higher education, are all tied up in wealth that was extracted from African labor. The church must beg forgiveness because Christians in America have not been about freedom, but about the theological papering over of America's original sins of conquest and servitude. And so we are here in a space created by Africans, a space of liberation, a space of welcome to each and every one of you. And I pray that after we have left here, you will no longer be seduced by the siren songs of empire that all is well, but together we will fight like hell until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, and reparations is only the beginning of that story. Thank you for your presence.
Thank you very much. We're moving right along because we have a tight program. We're anticipating Danny Glover arriving at any time, and he has to come and leave, and Sheila Jackson Lee will be coming. So we're going to be moving very, very rapidly. One of the best, that's not where I'm supposed to be. It is said that there's a time for all things in season. We are witnessing an incredible surge in interest and action on reparations reverberating around this nation, the Caribbean, and the world. One of the most important developments in this season of reparatory justice is the decision by the American Civil Liberties Union to endorse the concept of reparations for African Americans and to support H.R. 40. Give them up for them. That's a big decision. It is my pleasure to introduce the visionary behind this powerful decision, Jeffrey Robinson, the Deputy Legal Director and Director of the ACLU Justice and Equality Center, to present the overview and purpose for this important gathering. Jeffrey Robinson.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I am not a visionary, but I can see what's in front of my face. We are in an incredibly special place on a special day and for a special reason. And I cannot tell you how proud the ACLU is to partner with the National African American Reparations Commission to put on the first, and I want to emphasize that, the first in a series of forums on the promise of reparations for African Americans. The ACLU has a critical role to play in this struggle, and it is not to lead this struggle, because that's not what the ACLU can do. But that doesn't mean we have to sit on the sideline. What the ACLU can do is to use our platform and our resources to bring the voices of impacted leaders to the widest section of America possible so that the truth that the pastor was talking about can be shared not just with small groups, and we have a nice large group today, but we want to share this with thousands, if not millions of people. And the ACLU has a platform that enables us to try and do that. So we will be partnering with impacted leaders across this country to bring a series of forums that will let people understand the factual, moral, and social justifications for reparations for African Americans. One of my favorite movies has a line in it that says, "When the legend meets fact, print the legend." And that's what America has done with our history. We are all familiar with the legend of America: truth, justice, and freedom. But the facts don't match up with that legend. And we believe at the ACLU that if we can help impacted leaders bring their truth to the rest of America, we will see the passage of H.R. 40 and America moving toward what can and should be what we've always said we are. So that's all I have to say, because I want to get started with what you're going to see today. Buckle your seatbelts, because it's going to be interesting.
Again, Jeffrey Robinson, Deputy Legal Director for ACLU, and my new partner, and we've been working very, very closely together. Well, today's forum is going to be organized into 3 panels, the first of which is about to begin. I want to first say, however, that one of the best kept secrets in the country today is that there actually is a National African American Reparations Commission that has a 10-point reparations program and also supports H.R. 40. Not only supports H.R. 40, but has played a leading role, as you will hear, in transforming H.R. 40 into the bill that was the subject of the congressional hearing today. We have distributed, hopefully all of you have one, a pamphlet which has the background and origins of the National African American Reparations Commission, because I don't want to give you all the details today. It has a synopsis of the 10-point program and a list of the distinguished commissioners who are part of the National African American Reparations Commission. So suffice it to say that NAARC is delighted to be engaged in a principled, and I say principle because this is about working in a principled way, collaboration with ACLU in convening the first and what we hope will be a series of momentous gatherings like this. Now, our first topic is pretty straightforward, and let me just explain. We talk about the 6th principle of the Nguzo Saba is kuumba, creativity, right? We have to be able to be flexible and so forth. So again, Danny Glover may pop through the door any minute. Congressman Sheila Jackson Lee may pop through the door at any minute. Cory Booker may pop through at any minute, and we'll have to juggle and give them their moments as we move forward. So this first one is going to be an interesting kind of ride. But there are 3 panels. The first one that we're talking about now is the vision and meaning of H.R. 40. The second panel will be remembering and reflecting on reparations. And the third one will be a keynote presentation by Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, who's also en route. We have joining us for this panel 2 really, really dear friends and people who have worked on this issue for a long time. First, I'd like to introduce Attorney Nkechi Taifa, no stranger to many of you. She is a human rights, civil rights attorney. Actually did some work on this when she was at the ACLU many, many years ago. Previously, also a senior policy advisor for the Open Societies Foundations, and now has her own consulting firm. Would you please give it up for Sister Nkechi Taifa? And next we have Cam Howard, who is the national co-chairperson of NCOBRA, the National Coalition for Reparations for African Americans. And I think we know a special shout out to NCOBRA, because even when it wasn't popular, even when there was no surge, even when things looked dismal, there was one organization that was always on the case, persistently keeping the dream alive and organizing and working actually on HR 40 as well. So can we really give a salute to NCOBRA for the work that they've done on this issue over the years? Now, I want to begin with Sister Nkechi Taifa because I was at my church on Sunday and I was really announcing this program, and my pastor pulled me back up, and that's St. Mark AME Church, by the way, in East Elmhurst and Queens. He said, well, Dr. Daniels, you got to tell the congregation what Juneteenth is. So I did that. Then she pulled me back. She said, well, don't assume everybody knows what reparations is either. And so even though we have, I'm sure, a very progressive audience and people are listening, I don't want to take anything for granted. So I want to ask you if you would be kind enough to just share with us sort of a basic understanding of what reparations are or what reparations is or whatever the appropriate term is. Sister Nkechi.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Daniels. I'm be delighted to. I just want to first thank Reverend Lamar for opening up this historic church on this historic day for this historic issue, Metropolitan AME. I'd like to thank the ACLU for stepping up to the plate and getting outside your comfort zone and dealing with this issue that has been longstanding for such a long, long time. And I'd like to thank you, Dr. Ron Daniels, for you are a visionary. You can see, but you're also a visionary for linking this and bringing this all together. And my brother Cam right here, NCOBRA has always held a near and dear place in my heart. I was a founding member of NCOBRA. So to see where we are right now at this particular time just really warms my heart. So to get right into and answer your question, Dr. Daniels, reparations is a well-established principle of international law that the United States is very much aware of and has in fact paid out. It means the act or process of repairing or restoring. It is payment for an injury, redress for a wrong done. I submit in the context of Black people in America, the quest for reparations essentially encompasses 4 elements. Number 1, the formal acknowledgement of historical wrong and an official, unfettered apology for the dehumanization and the victimization and the atrocities of the enslavement era and beyond. Number 2, the recognition that the injury has continued throughout the years and it still manifests today. Number 3, the commitment to redress by the federal government, which sanctioned the enslavement and the subsequent de facto and de jure discrimination against Blacks by corporate entities, by religious institutions, by academic institutions, by private estates, which enjoyed unjust enrichment from the era. And number 4, the actual compensation in whatever form or forms are agreed upon. Reparations are due from the United States government because the government has not taken responsibility for its role in the enslavement and post-slavery segregation for millions. It has never attempted reparations for African Americans for the extortion of labor for many generations, deprivation of our freedom and our human rights, and terrorism, yes, terrorism against us throughout the century. So just succinctly, that's what reparations is to me.
Well, you know how to do it, Sister Nkechi. That's why I asked. Cam Howard, talk to us about the origins and goals of HR 40 as originally conceived. Yes, talk to us about that. But talk, because there's a rich history there that NCOBRA obviously played a very significant role in.
Yes, and the initial design of HR 40, when it was initially introduced, was one that Congressman Conyers tried to emulate with the Japanese bill that was introduced a year earlier. The Japanese bill was introduced as a form of starting a commission to look into the wrongful internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And that bill subsequently was passed and reparations were afforded to the Japanese, or awarded to the Japanese in the form of compensation. I think it was $20,000 per family And also a particular issue that faces us today was the release of Japanese prisoners who fought against their internment. And we have that same issue today where we're fighting for the release of black political prisoners who fought against all of the injustices that our ancestors have, that we and our ancestors have endured, especially around police terror and some of the other injustices here in America that we consume under the term crimes against humanity. And so a Detroit native by the name of Reparations, Ray Jenkins, that's how he became known in the movement, went to his Congressman John Conyers, and said that there should be a reparations bill. And so Congressman Conyers, in his dedication to justice for people of African descent, initiated that bill, introduced it in the House in 1988, I believe, and it has been, and reintroduced it for its entire tenure after that in Congress. And so it was initially designed, and it could talk about the difference between, it was revised in 2017, actually 2016, but it was introduced in 2017 by, at the request of NAARC. But it was initially designed to study whether or not there was injury among current living Africans, people of African descent, African Americans, at the time that it was introduced, from the history of enslavement, from the history of Jim Crow segregation, because this nation did not know or did not hold in a collective consciousness that those periods had any effect on current living Africans. And those of us who were in the movement had the total opposite position. And so Congressman Conyers felt that that was what the commission would need to focus on, whether or not there was continued injury, and if they found continued injury, let's see what type of recommendations we can make to address those injuries.
All right, thank you very much. Sister Nkechi, there appears to be now an unprecedented surge in interest in reparations. Talk to us, to our audience, about some of the major developments in the reparations movement historically. And I say that because we had people today who didn't seem to know that there were changes going on in the reparations movement. There are new forces that are out there who have just come on the scene and think that maybe reparations just happened yesterday. So I think it would be instructive for our audience here and throughout the world to understand that this is a long-standing movement. So would you please sort of give us some highlights of sort of the historic struggle of reparations in this country?
Thank you. Yes, well, it's important to recognize that the quest for reparations is not novel, nor is the demand new. Reverend Lamar asked us to speak the name of Belinda Royal. That was the first petition, recorded petition that we know of for reparations in this country. And Professor Ray Wimbush's book called, pamphlet called Belinda's Petition amply described that. She presented it to the Massachusetts General Assembly back in I think it was back in the 1700s, requesting a pension from the estate of a former slaveholder, estate which she had a large part in helping to build, and her petition did in fact yield a pension of 15 pounds and 12 shillings. Former Civil Rights Commissioner Mary Frances Berry illuminated the case of Callie House, okay? In her book, My Face is Black is True. And Callie House, along with the Reverend Isaiah Dickerson, really had, I would say, the first mass movement for reparations in the United States, having over 600,000 dues-paying members of the Ex-Slave Bounty and Mutual Relief and Pension Association. And that's what happened with the Honorable Marcus Garvey. She was unjustly, imprisoned. In the 20s, we did have the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association, thank you, Brother Senghor Baye, there, which galvanized hundreds of thousands of people seeking repatriation with repair, with reparations. During the 1950s and 60s, we had the great, the phenomenal Queen Mother Audley Moore, who really has been involved in just about every single major reparations movement from that time until her death in the 1990s. Even Dr. Martin Luther King, in his book, Why We Can't Wait, talked about, coming to get that check. Just about all of the various revolutionary groups during the 60s and 70s had the issue of reparations as part of their platform, whether we're talking about the Black Panther Party, whether we're talking about the Republic of New Africa, whether we're talking about the National Black United Front, whether we're talking about the Nation of Islam, all of them without fail talked about reparations. In 1969, James Foreman, we're in a church right now, James Foreman, civil rights activist, interrupted Sunday service at Riverside Baptist Church in New York and demanded that the churches pay, I forgot how much it was, $500 million or something along those lines, touted as only the beginning of what it was doing. Guess what? Several churches stepped up to the plate and, did in fact pay. But it was the turn of the century, Dr. Daniels and Kim Howard, with the formation of NCOBRA, National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, that really served to bring the issue of reparations from the fringes into the mainstream, and with this goal to begin to try to make reparations a household word. So NCOBRA worked closely with Congressman Conyers. And then, what's really instrumental in getting loads of different city councils throughout the country signed on to that resolution, various state legislatures also as well. There were corporate initiatives, there were litigation, initiatives, and then Ta-Nehisi Coates' article in the Atlantic, the case for Black reparations, hit the newsstands with a blast and really thrust it from the fringes, really slam dunk into a new generation of people to talk about, reparations. And then on up till today with NAARC, the National African American Reparations Commission, working alongside all of these other organizations that have been working for years and establishing a commission to actually begin to do some of that work that will happen once HR 40 passes, but to begin to start talking about and developing these proposals to set up a national trust fund authority to be able to be a repository and many other things. So here we find ourselves, as I come to a conclusion, to today. Today in Congress, okay, historic hearing on HR 40. It's not the first. There was one in 2007, but it barely blipped the radar screen. But now, as a result of all the energy, all the folk who are out there in this room, all the folk who are listening on social media and the like, we have turned this situation around and demanded that the world pay attention to our claim right here in the United States. And it's going to happen.
All right. I wonder what she really wanted to say. Cam Howard, I wish you would talk to us now about the transformation of HR 40 and why that's significant and what that means, because again, I saw in recent days, there were some people who obviously did not know the work that had gone on, that this has been transformed. So tell us, distinguish for us the difference between the original bill and the bill that was presented today, and why that's significant, and why that's significant.
Sure. So as I stated earlier, the initial bill was to, the major thrust was to determine whether or not there was continued injury among people of African descent. And so when NAARC was formed, at our inaugural meeting, NCOBRA had the opportunity to make the case that the way the bill had been written was no longer, it was obsolete in its writing, because there had been a tremendous amount of action since it was introduced to the time when we met, and I think in 2015, that stated without a contradiction that there's continued injury among people of African descent. So we didn't have to study that. For instance, the two apologies, the Senate apology and the House apology, both clearly states that it's that history of enslavement and Jim Crow segregation that have led to the disparities and the inequalities in urban centers among people of African descent. The 2001 Durban World Conference Against Racism unequivocally stated that the dichotomy in economies around the globe among white and black populations is a direct result of the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, colonialism and apartheid. And apartheid here in America was called Jim Crow segregation, which is this extreme separation and disparate treatment backed by the force of the state. So whether you call it Jim Crow or apartheid, it's still the same treatment. And so there was really no need to study whether or not there was continued injury anymore. The bill needed to begin from the position of there is injury, what's the greater impact of that injury, and how does it look among African people and in all of its facets, whether it's in the criminal justice system, or among economic development, among education, among housing, among peoplehood and nationhood, which NCOBRA has listed as one of its 5 injury areas. So in a myriad of ways in which African life exists in this country, we needed to have a definitive documentation on the range of the effect of those social practices. Not whether or not there was effect, but what is the full range of that effect. And so that's the major shift between the old legislation and the new legislation. The second major shift amongst the 2 legislation is around the notion of outcomes of the commission. The new legislation is called the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. And it's still around recommendations. It doesn't have the weight to apply resources to whatever the outcomes is. But the outcomes of this bill have been established, and we wrote into this bill the outcomes of what is reparations under international norms. Not looking at what American justice says reparations is or isn't, but what does the international community say what reparations are? And there's a whole ton of international law around reparations that we're not getting in here. For instance, under international law, reparations must, quote, wipe out all consequences, unquote, of the crime or of the harm. It must wipe out all consequences. And in order to wipe out all consequences, reparations must equate to, quote unquote, full reparations. And full reparations under international norms has 5 components. And the first component is cessation and guarantees of non-repetition. You must stop the bad acts that are being met out on the people, that are being done on the people. You must stop it. Here in America, there are a number of federal, state, and local laws that have a disproportionate effect on African people. They're not called black codes, but they're black codes in their reality because they have this disproportionate effect on African people. These laws must be searched and they must be stopped. And how do you guarantee non-repetition of these laws? There must be independent civilian community oversight of every police force in this country. That's the only way you're going to get to ensure that these type of atrocities being committed legally by police forces and other forces of the state from continuing to happen. The second component, I'm going to be real quick through these 4. The second component of full reparations is restitution. Now, these are the policies, programs, and projects around education, around housing, around economic development, and those type of things that have an institutional and structural effect on the racial inequality in this country. And then the third component is compensation. Yes, compensation is a form of full repair. And it will take some forms of compensation. It may be direct payments to families who are in a particular socioeconomic level. It may be direct payments to all families in the African community. But the commission is designed to determine how that compensation, if any, should be awarded. And that's why the commission is so important. The fourth component of reparations, full repair, is satisfaction. How do you return the dignity back to a people whose dignity has been eroded through the destruction of our image, destruction of our humanity, destruction of us as a people? One of the things and we heard a lot about that today, is the retelling of history. Truth must be told about what the African world has created to the life standards of all of America, that these people, that everyone is benefiting from off the backs of African life. So how do you return the dignity back to people? Museums, monuments, retelling of history, the retelling of the rewriting of textbooks, those things restore the dignity of people. And the fifth component is rehabilitation. How do you account for the mind, heart, and spirit damage to a people? And COBRA's having our 30th convention in Detroit starting tomorrow. So I'll be leaving here and we're going straight to Detroit. We've themed this particular convention 400 years of terror, a debt still owed. We can categorically document terror on the African life, on African humanity from the day we got here till today. Just a few days ago, we heard about the episode in Phoenix, Arizona, where these children, where his family guns were pointing at this family. That's terror. And it has been unabated in this country. There's a scientific form of scientific discipline called transgenerational epigenetics, and Mama Pat Newton, chair of the Black Psychiatrists Association, could tell us more about it. But what it states is that there were studies among third-generation descendants of Jewish Holocaust survivors, and they found that they had a disproportionate effect of lifestyle diseases than their peers whose grandparents did not go through that experience. And they found out through research that there was a portion of their gene called the epigene that had been transformed as a result of their trauma, and that transformed gene was passed down intergenerationally. So after 6 years of trauma in the Jewish Holocaust, they had a genetic transformation of their gene, of a portion of their gene. Well, we can document 400 years of uninterrupted trauma, so we know that there's not only just a spiritual effect or income effects or housing effects of enslavement, there's actually physical effects of enslavement among current living Africans, and we're passing those down to our children. So the commission has a tremendous amount of work to do that these organizations cannot do on their own. The resources of the federal government must be directed at the healing of African people in every area of this full repair, and it's spelled out in HR 40, the new legislation.
And I want to thank CAM, but certainly in COBRA, but convening the commission, I have to listen and learn as well. And I have to say I've learned a great deal, CAM, from your scholarship and you laying the case out and helping us to understand the full depth of this as you've articulated. And that's been translated, and I have to reiterate again, the bill that you see now is a bill that we collectively helped to make happen. It didn't just happen because we were working on it. Sister Nkechi Taifa, some people will say, well, this HR 40 thing may or may not pass. It's out there and it's a whole lot of surge going on at the present. But what if it never passes? So why is it important to engage this struggle around HR 40, whether or not it passes or not? Your perspective on that?
Well, we must continue. We must never give up. It is a matter of justice. There is no statute of limitations on addressing human rights violations. In fact, over time, it grows. The amount due grows greater with interest. There must be acknowledgement for the wrong done. There must be apology. There must be atonement. Acknowledgement with repair is absolutely essential. Let me just say this, if I can. I did a radio program early this morning before going to the Hill, and the person who came on before the person was going to interview me said, okay, well, how do you pronounce your name? And I said, well, and this is part of the harm. We talk about cultural genocide. I said, well, I pronounce it Nkechi Taifa, and then I'm thinking, well, actually, if I were in Nigeria, it would be Nkechi, not Nkechi, because when I got my name out of African Names Book when I was 16 years old, I didn't know that the N had the N sound like in Nkrumah, because I had never heard of Nkrumah. So I mean, this is part of the trauma, of the harm, of the destruction. Ta-Nehisi Coates, people look at that name. Oh, no, that's Ta-Nehisi. Well, no, it's pronounced Ta-Nehisi. See, we have been culturally deprived, but we need to explain what our name is, or if we picked it out of a names book, part of the harm is we didn't really know the right pronunciation. We have been stripped. We've been stripped of our culture. Okay, and even when I found out the correct pronunciation of my name when I was in college, I've been saying Nakichi for so long. I just say, well, you know, I'm a new African. I'm a new branch of the African lineage on this side of the ocean. So that's part of my self-determination. That's how I'm going to pronounce it. But I mean, I don't know why I went off on that tangent, Ron, but I just want one more tangent if I can. When I was coming over here on the, to the hearing, for the first time, I went and pulled up the video from Phoenix, Arizona, and I just had tears in my eyes. The video of the young husband and wife with the young children and the little 4-year-old who took a Barbie doll out of a dollar store, and the response of the police. This is part of the harm, the response, the trauma that this family faced as a result of. I'm just saying, I had tears that just poured, just wouldn't go away. Even though we've had our Michael Browns and we've had our Eric Garners and we've had our, the Walter Scotts and, Aisha, the list goes on and on and on. I don't know this particular thing. Luckily, no one was killed in that time, but this is part of the harm that needs to be repaired. We need to fix the criminal punishment system as well. Totally tangent, I'm sorry, but
It's all good, and we got time. Danny Glover's on the way, by the way, but that gives us a little bit more time. Cam, would you take the same question? Why is it important, moving forward? And by the way, Encobra had put together a very powerful primer on H.R. 40, and I wish you would just share that because the audience can actually get copies of that and know what H.R. 40 is. So again, why is H.R. 40 important in terms of the organizing, education, and so forth moving forward?
Sure. Let me talk about the primary real quick. This document can be found on encobraonline.org. It's a primer on H.R. 40. It talks about why the need for H.R. 40 now. It goes into the difference of H.R. 40 from a study bill to a remedy, what we call a remedy bill. It talks about the rationalization for revising the bill. And then it looks at the 5 areas of for repair and what type of programs, and policies, and practices can be put in place in each of those areas. And you'll see also in here how NAARC's 10-point reparations platform fits into those 5 areas of full repair. And certainly those are not just the only ones that can be included, but definitely it is a teaching tool. And then it ends with a sister statement on reparative justice around the historic sex crimes that have been committed on African women since we've been in this country. So it's a very important document that we put together. It also lists, it's dated because it was written in the 115th Congress, and this is the 116th Congress. So the pictures of the congresspersons who were co-sponsors in the 115th Congress are listed, and those who are co-sponsors in the 116th Congress are not. And of course, those who have sponsored Senate Bill S-1083, that was patterned after H.R. 40 in the Senate by Cory Booker, introduced by Cory Booker. That's not in here also, but online we've updated the primer, or we're updating the primer, and you can go there for any updates. So if H.R. 40 is not passed, why is it important to the movement? Several reasons. One reason we know I'm being taught, and certainly I'm an effect I'm being taught by the psychological community that the act of struggle is self-repair for African people. And part of reparations is self-repair. And so in the fight for reparations comes repair among our dignity that we hold for ourselves, as well as self-esteem and self-respect. So in that instance, we have to continue to struggle and continue to fight, whether it's passed or not. If it's not passed, for me, it says I can conclude that there is a undenying resolve on the American government to hold African people in an inferior and underdeveloped state. If it's not passed, I can conclude that there's a resolve of the American government to continue to keep people of African descent in this fourth-class citizenship status. I can conclude that there's a resolve of this government to continue the inequalities and the disparate outcomes of life for African people through perpetuity. That's what I can conclude if this legislation is not passed. Now, if that in fact is the case, then what is our response? Then we're going to have to step up as Nkechi said, we're going to have to step up our struggle to a higher level. What does that mean? Does it mean separation? Does it mean some other form of revolutionary type of action? But clearly, if this government refuses, after all of the testimony, all of the scholarship, all of the declarations by not only President Bush and President Clinton, who's included in their apologies, but also on the international level, if it refuses to acknowledge any of the facts, physical, income, education, etc., that African life experience as a result of the crimes against our humanity, if it refuses, then we have to take it to another level.
One of the things, as again, we wait for Danny Glover to come, and he should be here momentarily and will, in effect, help to conclude the session. I also wanted to talk about, and both Nkechi, you and Cam can speak to this, is that the action with H.R. 40 in the Senate and the House is one thing, but the work that NCOBRA has been doing and other organizations has reverberated in other ways. For example, and I was going to say this in my conclusion, I'll say it now. I received a call from a dear friend of mine. His name is Brother Baruti, Assemblyman Charles Barron from New York, revolutionary in office. And he called to report that he had already introduced an H.R. 40 type bill in the New York State legislature. In other words, what people are doing, or they're looking at what's happening at the national level and replicating at the state level. His report was, not only had it been introduced, and it is absolutely modeled after the work that we did with the National African American Reparations Commission. It just passed the Committee for Government Operations in the New York State Assembly. It has gone on now to the Ways and Means Committee. So he said to me, well, that's what we were able to get this session, but next session it goes into the Ways and Means Committee. Now, when it goes to the Ways and Means Committee, what does that mean? That's the committee that, if it approves it, is also going to do what? Allocate the funds to create a H.R. 40 type committee in the state of New York. And so I want to talk about that too, because I know there's some action in Illinois that you've been involved in as well. But in addition to H.R. 40, you have been doing these accountability actions that NCOBRA has been talking about as well. So, Nkechi, would you start and then pass it to Cam, or you just want Cam to just take it all?
He can start, and then I want to talk about, even though we have all these very critical state and local issues, still why the federal government is nevertheless.
Okay, good. Go right ahead.
Sure. So I did forget to mention the state and local actions that we're doing also as a result if H.R. 40 is not passed. I've worked with Charles Barron, and he did model the New York Commission after H.R. 40, the revised H.R. 40. And that's very exciting that it has passed lower committee. I think one of the New England states has also introduced legislation around creating the commission. On the local level, there are various cities that still have slavery disclosure ordinance on their books. And Chicago is one. We are working to have that one strengthened, where corporations and institutions that have ties to the enslavement of African people, either during the period of enslavement or even post-enslavement through convict leasing, that they have to report that. And then if they fail to report it, then the city contracts that they entered into would be null and void. In Chicago, that's very important because many of you know that the Obama Presidential Center is being built in Chicago. And one of the major players in the building of the Obama Center is the University of Chicago. And some graduate students revealed a couple of years ago that the University of Chicago's initial land was donated by Stephen Douglas of the Lincoln Douglas debates. Douglas inherited a plantation from his wife's family in Mississippi, and from that money he moved to Chicago, started his political career, and as a result donated money to start the initial University of Chicago. Well, the University of Chicago is denying their complicity, saying that they moved from the old university campus to the new university campus, and they didn't take anything with them, but they took their books, they took their scholars, and they took their funders with them. So we say there's a continuation of that particular university. In them not reporting that they had slave ties, we are organizing ourselves to halt the construction of the Obama Library. And this is how the importance of being active on the ground can play an effect, and now there's talks about entering into a community benefits agreement as a result of these actions. I know in Houston, Texas, there are some actions around the Sugarland plantation. And all across the country, you'll find that people are organized around specific entities. Georgetown University is a particular institutional action that's being done. And there's other universities that also are being targeted. There's other corporations that are being targeted. We targeted in Chicago Norfolk Southern Railroad, a $14 billion corporation that made $2 billion in 1 year with the announcement that it was expanding its rail yard in the city of Chicago. As a result of our actions, we were able to force them, and COBRA was able to force them to create better diesel emission equipment, enter into a community benefits agreement with the city, with the residents of that community, and other forms of concessions, as they were called. So there's other actions that we can do to make the lives of our people better, continuing in this vein of reparatory justice.
So a lot of people, first of all of these state and local actions are extremely critical. Tulsa, there was a settlement for the total obliteration of what we call Black Wall Street during the 20s. In Rosewood, Florida, there was a settlement. In Chicago, the ordinance for the police torture. There was actually a model reparations settlement there. But with respect to the federal government, we must remember the origins of Black people in this country. We are the descendants of Africans kidnapped and transported to the United States with the explicit complicity of the United States government in every single arm of the United States law-making and law-enforcing machinery. U.S. federal law, state law, high court decisions, lower court decisions, the dehumanization, the atrocities of the enslavement era was actually a matter of war. It was in fact war. We need to look at it that way. It was war conducted against us. The kidnapping was a wrongful act for which our ancestors and we as the heirs are entitled to damages. The enslavement was a wrongful act in which we, our heirs and we as the descendants are entitled to damages. The stealing of our labor, all of that, we are entitled to reparations. The compensations we speak of are owed to us. Just take a look at the Constitution. One of the articles talked about the continued importation of kidnapped African prisoners of war to any state that might desire us until the year 1808. That's in the Constitution. In the Constitution also upheld 3/5 of a man in the Constitution. In the Constitution, the fugitive slave law, which mandated that no escaped African, even if he or she reached a free state, none of us was free. And it was a constitutional obligation of duty of every single white man, woman, or child to deliver us up to the government. The compensations we speak of from the federal government are, in fact, owed to us. And it goes on and on, with bring it on up to the current day with the redlining, the convict, leasing to police brutality, and all of that. There's a continuation, and that continuation must be compensated.
What up? Just want to remind our listening audience that you are listening to a live broadcast. It's coming on WPFW here in Washington, D.C., also WBAI in New York, also streaming on the website of the American Civil Liberties Union, the Institute of the Black World 21st Century, and the Caribbean is in the house. by way of the University of West Indies television as well. So this is being aired globally, and we thank all of you for being here. Well, actually, we're waiting for Danny Glover, but I think we have to actually transition 2 minutes. Okay, 2 minutes. You'll be here in 2 minutes to close it out. No, I'm talking about Danny Glover will be here in 2 minutes. She's giving me that cue on that side. So we're going to get ready for the next panel, actually, as we do that. But let me just say that, first of all, give it up for this panel. Were they really wonderful? Yes. Right. And by the way, if there is a question you have or a point of view, hold it till after. We're going to have some time afterwards, if you will. And on cue, would you please give it up for our UN ambassador for the UN Decade of African Descent, none other than Danny Glover, comes in just on cue. Danny Glover. Danny Glover. Danny Glover. Got to get to the airport, Danny Glover. Come on up, Danny Glover. Give it up for the person who gives entirely of his energy and time, was tore it up before the hearing with Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. At this microphone, please. You don't get one. You get one of these.
Thank you. Thank you, Ron, Daniels, and all of you here today in this very critical and important moment we have here in the discussions of reparatory justice reparations. There's been so much work that's been done that's laid the ground, right, a ground for what we talk about now, from the moment at the end of slavery and before that. And it's fascinating how the role that we've played in that. It was newly freed, formerly enslaved Africans who were the first to bring public education to the South during Reconstruction. An amazing kind of revelation that we don't often know about, that we've always been at the forefront as participants in our own rescue. We've always been there organizing and always telling truth and speaking truth to power there in so many different ways. So the idea that we now have an extraordinary moment in history to not only use our collective power and carry on the work that's been done by the ancestors and those who've been in the past. We have this moment right now. It is no longer a moment that's on the fringe of discourse. It is the process that is at the point where it's right at the center of the discourse. We cannot talk about where we go from here. As Dr. King would say, from a community of chaos, unless we talk about the community that we have to build now, the big community of justice, the community of respect that we have to build now, using platforms this platform of reparation. We just had this amazing discourse. The first time that we've had the kind of hearing that we had, I believe, around reparatory justice. And the scholars and those who have done the research and who have been never in the wilderness with us, but certainly in the wilderness when it comes to establishment, now have their particular day, their particular moment to talk about this and to get something done, not simply to talk about it, but to get something done. And so when we go, wherever we go, whether it's South Carolina, where we go to California, wherever, the Old South or the San Francisco, we can talk about reparatory justice and reparations. We can talk about that. And we can demand from those people who carry our vote, who want us to vote for them, what's your position on reparations? And it is for those of us who are old timers in the struggle, and for those of us who are new to the struggle, who are youngsters right now, what we do is continue building the foundation and the foundation that they'll stand on in the future as they're ready. But thank you. I wanted to come here and certainly because I mean, you probably we're broadcasting this on on television. All over the world. It's all over the world, man. You know. No, man, this is better than Lethal Weapon, huh? That's all over the world, man. But certainly, thank you for your participation. And even though this historic church, this is a historic church right here, and we have this here historic church. It's right at the center of another historic moment as well. Thank you so much, sir.
No, I have to, the reason we're doing that, because I have his executive assistant, says, get him to the plane. He has to get to another event in Chicago, and if he doesn't make it, I'm the one who would be held responsible. So I am doing my duty. Let's give it up again for Danny Glover. Again, for Danny Glover. Danny Glover, he doesn't like for me to say this, but he's in the spirit of Paul Robeson. He's a person of great talent, but he has used that talent in the same way that he was with Sonia Sanchez and others at San Francisco State when they created the Black Studies Department at San Francisco State. He has never forgotten from whence he's come in terms of an orientation for liberation. So when he's in the arena of theater and films, there are times when he could have been more, but he takes time out, time and time again, to go all across the world, Central and South America, Africa, being the ambassador, speaking out, because at his core, he is for the liberation of all human beings. Again, for Danny Glover. Let's give it up for Danny Glover. And there are others who are stepping up. John Legend has now come out in favor of reparations. Sheila Jackson Lee had a session with him over the weekend, and he is now fully on board. And that's the kind of example that we need to follow. We're moving right ahead, and our next panel will be moderated by, again, Jeffrey Robinson, of course, our Deputy Legal Director, whom you met from the ACLU that you met earlier. So we're going to invite to the stage, please, Dr. Ivor Carruthers, the General Secretary of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Project. Got to help escort her up to the stage, please. Do we have the, we're supposed to have the little cards here. I guess they'll be put up, but it doesn't really matter. 2 on this side and 2 on that side. All right. And Nana, Dr. Patricia Newton, who is the CEO of the Black Psychiatrists of America. Now, she just came off a plane coming from somewhere. I keep telling her, I just want to be her valet, because she's traveling all over the world. She and Dr. Ivor Carruthers, I am petitioning. And also, joining the panel is, I think somebody told us that she said, this sister's a bad sister. She really shakes things up, and she shook them up today in the hearing. I guess she'll be joining us very shortly, and that's none other than, of course, Dr. Juliet Malvo, who is a political economist, and of course, the president emeritus of Bennett College for Women, but she's just a bad sister who also tells it like it is. So she'll be joining the panel momentarily. And I guess, is Katrina here? Katrina Brown will be joining us. She's supposed to be, well, we assume that she's on her way. The hearing, I suppose, went late and on, and that was very important because that was the U.S. congressional hearing that people attended. And so I now want to turn it over to our moderator for this panel. Please give up another round of applause for Jeffrey Robinson.
So I'm going to ask if I can get some help up there, and if you would hit the down arrow one more time. Okay, this is the panel that we're about to start. And the title of this panel, Remembering, Reflecting, and Reparations, is significant. And we would like to start this panel by playing a clip from an upcoming documentary. What you're about to see is a clip that's about 8 minutes and 24 seconds long. It is a clip from an upcoming documentary called Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America. This is a clip, or a documentary, that's based on some work that I've been doing over the past 7 or 8 years. We would just like to ask that for anyone who is recording, broadcasting, or publishing, if you would not record, broadcast, or publish during the playing of this clip. I would like to start the discussion, and we thought that clip would be particularly helpful when we're talking about remembering, reflecting, and reparations. We say words like enslavement, words like lynching, and it's important to know that there are human beings behind those words whose lives were impacted and destroyed. And I would like to start, if I could, with Dr. Carruthers. And Dr. Carruthers, much of the work that you have done is about preserving sacred sites. One of the things that was so important to Jo Golding McCall is to have a marker about what happened to her father. And she described just a little bit of what she went through to get that marker put on the side of the highway. Why is that so important? The concept of preserving sacred sites.
I think the connection between remembrance and reparations is a pathway to healing. And the act of a marker is an act of remembrance. I think we should really spend the contemplative time necessary to claim those markers. The sacred books, the sacred texts talk about those markers and the remembrance of how God was with us. What becomes really important, I think, is for us to claim that with intentionality, to say that we are claiming the divinity within us by remembering those markers. And that, to the question of the last panel, it really doesn't matter what others do or not do. We don't have the right not to demand remembrance and reparations. So I sit here looking at your documentary and thinking about a few months ago developing a documentary on the Elaine massacre of 1919 in Elaine, Arkansas, in which we had named it Hush Month, because what the persons who experienced that terror were told to do was to hush their mouth, to go to work, and things would be all right. But the ancestors of those who were massacred, we're talking about somewhere between 200 to 800, massacred many in a church, women and men and children who were daring to organize around their labor and organize around their wages from selling of cotton. Massacre. So what I think is important for us to understand about the marking is that as I sit here and I think about the fact that it was the Elaine massacre, that my grandmother would tell the story around which her brother came home and said, "I'm out of here." And we got a letter 4 to 5 years later where he had settled in Brazil. So now I 6 generations of family in Brazil, one of whom married a Nigerian. We have come full circle. But what we must do as a family is to mark and to understand the terror and the horror and the trauma that define the nature of our personal stories and our collective stories. And that's why markers are so important. And that's why I feel so privileged to have in February facilitate leading 600 plus clergy and lay leaders to Montgomery, Alabama on a pilgrimage to stand and consecrate those sacred grounds of the National Peace and Justice Memorial of the Equal Justice Institute, as well as the Legacy Museum. We have to remember as a counter to the dismembering that we have been so silent about. But what this historic day represents as an act of breaking the silence.
I'd like to go to Dr. Melvin. And I guess the question I have is history just the past? And is it dead? Or is it something else?
Well, I would commend to the audience, first of all, thank you, Pastor Lamar, for opening encouragement. Thank you, Dr. Brown Daniels, for your leadership and your work. Thank all of you for being here. I want to thank the ACLU for collaboration with NAARC. We really do appreciate it. Now, is the history just the past or is it alive? It's alive as well. There's a film that I'd like to recommend that people take a look at. It's called Wilmington on Fire. It's about what happened to Wilmington in 1898. The terms were these. Black people and Republicans came together to try to create some fusion energy. There's a word written in a book called the Fusion Group. White Democrats were incensed that white people would talk to black people. The only known coup d'etat that took place in this country took place in 1898 when these people called the red shirts, which were the Klan without robes, they wore red shirts instead. They went to a city council meeting and basically demanded everybody resignate so that they could take over. But see, the other thing they did, there was a brother named Alexander Manley, and he owned the first statewide black newspaper in the state of North Carolina. He was a bad memory jammer, and he was of mixed heritage. His dad was reported to be, they said his dad was probably the governor. He was very fair-skinned, blah, blah, blah. But he was a raceman. So this white woman gave a speech and said, we could lynch 1,000 Negroes per day to protect the chastity of white women. Now, footnote, I'll come back to that. I.B. Wells began to document lynchings. Lynchings were not about interracial sex. They were about economic envy. But that was a trope. You know, these black men trying to have sex with white women. What both Manley and I.B. Wells wrote is that I.B. Wells documented 1/3 of lynchings were about interracial sex. The others were about economics. Of that 1/3, she asserted half of them were consensual. And the only time it became a lynching issue is when either the white girls cried rape and she got busted, or the brother got bold, he got totally in public. He knew better than that. But in any case, basically, it was 1/3 and half of them were consensual. So put it outside. So when this woman, Helen somebody on the road, gave this speech, it went all over the South. And Alex Manley wrote back, saying, white girls better watch their women. A, and B, y'all white men need to stop talking smack about your women when you mess with our women. Now, his piece was replicated all over the South, and it was like a price on his head. Because he basically, I wrote about it at some link to the ACLU blog, so you can check it out and you see my piece. But anyway, they replicated all over the South, so it was a price on his head. So you combine these Republicans and these fusion people on one hand, with his brother who's basically saying, why do it opposed? Excuse me, Pastor, I didn't really hear that. But he used to be, so this is my church, so. But in any case, that combination gave them rise to basically, the night before they took over, arrested all the prominent black men in the town, and the next morning gave them one-way tickets out, which meant they had to get rid of they lost their property, they lost their home, they lost everything. It's documented that at least 60 people were killed. But in this film, Wilmington on Fire, they say that, whites brag that the Wilmington River was awash with black lives. No, it was probably more than 60. But just like Tulsa, we don't have an accurate count of what happened there either. So in any case, the reason why this film is impactful, Dr. Lewis Manley, who's a grandson of the Alice family who was run out of town, talks about what his family lost, what could have been. The fact that they were wealthy people. In fact, Wilmington, what was interesting about Wilmington in 1898 is you had a thriving black middle class. You had black businesses, you had everything that you could imagine. But all that was lost. They lost 2,500 black residents in the course of a year. They lost 25% of their black-owned businesses in the course of a year. And there are people, survivors, who you'll see in this film. It's on Vimeo. But there are survivors who talk about what they lost. So it's history, but it's also very real. And so there are two aspects of reparations that we need to lift up. One is that there are instances where you can identify individuals who lost stuff. So you know that they are owed. In my own family, we have the case of what we call the moving fence. We own property in Moss Point, Mississippi. I call it Mississippi GD. Cleaning it up, y'all know what I mean. We had access to a bayou, which was very fish rich, and it was ours. We let other people use it, but it was ours. We woke up one day, the fish had moved. I mean, the fence had just moved. And they're like, we dare you to prove that this is your land. A cousin went missing. We believe that he was killed. Eventually, years later, maybe 30 years later, they named the land they took from us Hawkins Lane after our family, so that was supposed to be our reparation. So there are individuals who can show what they lost. But the bigger piece is what was the effect of lynching or Williamsburg or Tulsa on the black mindset? Because I believe that it was a deterrent to people amassing capital, it was a deterrent to people opening businesses. If you knew that opening a business could get you lynched, you're gonna keep your head down. As you say, you're gonna keep your head down. You're not gonna open a business. You're gonna be quiet, you're gonna be humble. And literally, Ida B. Wells said, lynching is an act of white supremacy. And really what it did was to reinforce. And that white supremacy is alive and well. How does a policeman take a gun to a woman, a pregnant woman, because her 4-year-old walked out the 5 and dime with a doll that was worth 99 cents? I mean, come on. How does Tamir Rice, little boy, get shot? We could just call the roll of this, but it's because of white supremacy. Somebody told these people that it was okay. So the past is not gone. The past is here. What's different is that more of us are clear about what the past is, and more of us are willing to talk about it. What's also clear is that while race and poverty are overlapping things, and you have poor white people and, whatever, race and poverty are also very different things. And you see, as our economic structure, as a structure of predatory capitalism is breaking down in terms of increased number of white people who are experiencing poverty, you see people beginning to look around and ask the question, why is this the case? I mean, Dr. King said in 1968, there are 40 million poor people in America. You have to ask your question, why are there so many poor people? When you ask a question, he said, you must ask a question about the basic nature of our economy. He goes on to say, you see, who owns the oil? Who owns the iron ore? If the world is 2/3 water, why should we pay water bills? Now, don't send that to the water company, it ain't gonna work. But the point is that he really was talking about economic structure. So we have a structural issue that affects everybody, and then you have a race issue that affects black folks. Both of these things are rooted in our history, and that history is not going to go away. So we had better reckon with it. And we have to reckon with it in terms, both black folks and white folks, and the rest of our nation. Our nation is built on a foundation of enslavement. There would be no United States were it not for enslavement. I call the place that the orangutan lives, I call him the orange orangutan. The orangutan lobby has asked me not to do that, but I do it anyway. But anyway, I call the place the house that enslaved people built. Because that's what it is, the house that enslaved people built. And built the Congress and built all that. And so that you can't get past that. You simply can't get past that. So the history is alive and well. We have to revisit and revisit and revisit until we fix it. And the fact is that I just come from, I'm sure that Dr. Daniels talked about the hearings where we were, and someone asked a question, why should Congress do anything to fix this? Because Congress messed it up in the first place. They would not pass legislation to prevent lynching. The NAACP went to the mat until the 1920s. Anti-lynching legislation, they wouldn't pass it. Southern senators didn't want anti-lynching legislation. What did they say then? Lynching is okay, which means economic intimidation is okay. And so that's why history still matters.
I want to pick up with one of the last things that you talked about and go for a second to Katrina Brown, because Ms. Brown, your connection to this issue is somewhat unique. And you are the producer and director of a documentary called Traces of the Trade. Would you share with folks what that documentary is about, and maybe picking up on what Dr. Malvo was saying about our history and how important that is?
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here with everyone today. So the film is the result of my learning in my late 20s that my ancestors from Rhode Island were slave traders, and that they were actually the worst of the worst, which we didn't realize in my family, but a historian had studied the Rhode Island slave trade, and he did the numbers, and basically the DeWolfs, by virtue of being involved in the trade for 3 generations, were basically the single family most complicit in the slave trade of any family, North or South. And this, as you can imagine, just completely rocked my world on a couple levels. The first was learning this from my grandmother, and then realizing within moments that I already knew and had repressed it. So very quickly, I learned that what I had done on this very personal level was a microcosm of what the North as a whole had done, which is amnesia about the history of Northern complicity in slavery. So I decided to make a documentary film because it felt like a story that was really important to tell. And you can imagine, like, once you start digging, there's more and more revelation. So as I shared in my testimony this morning, you know, there was slavery in the North for over 200 years. The North, Rhode Island in particular, dominated the slave trade. Ancillary businesses all across the North were tied up in slavery and the slave trade. So you had obviously the boat makers, the sail makers, the rum distillers, those who produced food that were
The Lehman Brothers.
The Lehman Brothers in New York were cotton brokers. Insurance companies in Connecticut and New York, banks, et cetera. And then even on top of all of that was the fact that even once slavery and the slave trade were abolished in the North, it was raw materials from southern plantations and from the Caribbean, from the islands, that was being brought to northern factories to be processed. So the cotton mills that we all know so much about in Lowell, et cetera. So in every kind of way, the North was in this web, this economic system. And, the victors write the history books. So when the North wins the Civil War, which incidentally, the North did not enter the Civil War to end slavery, even if Lincoln might have had that goal, the average Northerner, I mean, in New York City, there were draft riots by white folks who did not want to join the Union and go south to have anything to do with the issue of slavery and ending slavery. So by virtue of winning the Civil War, the North writes the history books in their favor, and the story becomes, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, end of story. And in terms of how history affects the present day, I would just jump us right up to the present and say, when we ask the question of how the dynamics between the white North and the white South are unresolved and how those are still impacting the politics of this country, you suddenly see, you can't help but connect the dots between then and now in terms of the self-righteousness of the North, white Southern resentment of that self-righteousness, because white Southerners actually know more about Northern complicity than Northerners do. So they resent because we are always looking down our noses at them. And hence a lot of the politics of resentment that still plague us to this day. So the film was to document a journey to retrace the triangle trade that 10 of us in my family took in the year 2001. So I wrote to 200 relatives, 9 people signed up, and we retraced the triangle trade from Rhode Island to Ghana to the slave forts to Cuba, where the DeWolfs owned plantations. And we're trying to face the past and deal with it and have lots of messy, confusing feelings and conflict and arguments and do we owe or don't we owe? And I just figured, inspired partly by Mackie Alston, who's filming me right now, who had made the film Family Name, this idea of putting a white family kind of on camera under the microscope a bit. I just knew, as you had done, that it would help. It's like if my family could face this past that was like really horrendous, maybe that would inspire other white people to face their relatively less horrendous relationship to slavery, but relationship nonetheless. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I find it just really interesting that the whole myth that you talked about in terms of the pure North and the evil South and how the victors get to write the history. And the first ship that was built in America to go to Africa to get more enslaved people was built not in the Gulf Coast of Mississippi or Alabama, it was built in Massachusetts. And the first 3 ships that were built by America to go to Africa to get enslaved people were named the Hope, the Prosperity, and the Desire. Those were the words that white Northerners associated with the concept of owning people as property. And I now want to go to Dr. Newton because as we have heard the different discussion, I go back to the clip that we showed, and when I asked Jo Bowling McCall about why she thought they did this to her father, and she talked about him being successful, but she said they did it for terroristic reasons to convince other black folks don't try to be successful. And I know that one of the things that you have worked on and studied and talked about is the concept of trauma that is passed from one generation to another. And could you talk to us for a bit about how that works into the discussion we're having today?
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased and honored to be with this illustrious group of people. And thank you, Dr. Daniels, and thank all of you all for joining us, and also the pastor and members of Metropolitan. There's a phrase in the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest that goes, "They work on you in ways you cannot fight. They keep on and on until you are fixed." The fear is a transmissible fear that carries from one generation to another. Not only is it a conditioned response, but it's also transmitted through a genetic reaction. A lot of data on trauma and its effect on future generations has been done looking at the Jewish Holocaust. Dr. Rachel Yehuda and others at Sinai talked about how the children and the children of the children of those victims of the Nazi encampment had anxiety and fear as a result of that experience. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if a few years or a few decades happened to the Jewish people, what 400 years did to our people. And so the African that got on that boat is not the African that got off that boat. And so the changes that occurred from being on the open field near the Gambia River. I just got back from Gambia and Senegal this morning, so forgive me if I sound a little crazy. And all of a sudden one day you're snapped and you're put in the hull of a ship and you're put in darkness, people who are used to light, and you are subjected to excrement and dead carcasses. I want you to envision this with me for a minute. And you are put in a stench environment, and you then have to live through that. There are compensatory neurobiological and neurochemical and neuropsychological changes that occur as a result for us to have the luxury of today's discourse. So that those of us who sit here and intellectualize reparations are the byproduct of survivors, but at what cost? And the cost that we've had to deal with has to do with changes in our neurocircuitry, changes in our mentation, changes in our physical structures. Trauma, we now know, through many, many years of research, this is not something that needs to be studied in the context of its existence, but it has to be studied as it relates to us. We now know that those changes create physical, mental, and yes, spiritual changes in the human body. We now know that hormones that are supposed to keep you ready for fight, flight, cannot be kept up in a state of complexity 24/7, 365. So that the trauma that occurred then continues with today's microaggressions, with today's police brutality, with today's issues. We're not dealing with post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic slavery. We're dealing with complex compound slavery that continues from that generation to this generation and for generations unborn. And so the data exists as it relates to general trauma. And so when she says about the fear of success, it is not just that fear. What it has also created in our people is a denial that they don't want to address, that I don't want to deal with this, that it really didn't happen. And then you have people who say, well, it happened to a long time ago. Our ancestors did it, but we didn't have anything personally to do with it. So we haven't also looked at the traumatic effects to the perpetrators and how that continues to play out in the perpetratory acts that continue to affect our people. So we have neurobiological changes. We have changes in the DNA. We know that men who have been traumatized, their RNA changes, not just the uterus and the embryo, but we know that these things then cause us to have adjustments that we make in order to to survive. And so when we look at it, we're not looking at a single entity. We have to look at a longitudinal reality. And in addition to the genetic changes, what are the effects of the environment then and now upon the manifestation and expression of those genes? And so that's where we are. We're dealing with a complex compound situation that cannot be simply talked about in a just a little gist of, oh, well, we'll give you some money and that'll make it right. You will never be able to repay us for the damage that has been done in the context of what has happened to us as a people. However, having said that, there's also the issue of healing a nation. and a nation who has within its mindset a memory of historical realities that they're in denial about. These are defense mechanisms, and defense mechanisms that are pathological. And so as a result of that, if America is to heal, if America is to really make right what it did that's wrong, white people, black people, and all people are going to be affected by what happened in the sins of the father. And so I am just simply saying that the health effects, when we talk about reparations and reparatory justice, we have to talk about the then, the now, and the future, which is an African cosmology, because we deal with our historical ancestors and we pray for our next generation. So in other words, there has to be a philosophical African approach to the healing and understanding and the study and the research that needs to be done that has never been done on what happened to us and how it affects our mind, our body, and our spirit. Those hormonal changes that occur, that create the fear, that keep your cortisol levels elevated, that keep your norepinephrine elevated, also continue to keep us sick with hypertension and diabetes, despite our diet, despite our exercise, and despite the kinds of things that would help us, so that the poverty that exists and all these other things that create anxiety also create inflammation. And that inflammation in the body causes dementia, it causes cancer, it causes all of these other health effects. So we're not just dealing with a simple problem. And these effects interact economics, interact your spirituality, interact everything. So yes, the fear is there, and so is the healing.
I am going to ask, please. I guess I'm going to take a moment of personal privilege because I have a question I need to ask you.
Yes, sir.
About an incident that I think most people are familiar with in Chicago. A young 9 or 10-year-old black child is approached by police officers. They think that a young kid has a gun. This kid has no gun. He hasn't done anything wrong. As they approach him, he runs. They chase him. He urinates all over himself.
Right.
And he is handcuffed behind his back, and they lecture him about running from the police, and they send him home. And the question that kept coming into my mind is, what is going on in the mind of that child that makes him urinate all over himself just because police want to talk to him?
Well, that's an autonomic response. I mean, you have symbolism within the television that shows you that the police are your enemy. You have symbolism in every example within your community that says, if I am young and black and police approach me, the likelihood that I'm going to die is real. And so the children are incorporating that. It gets incorporated in an early age, and it gets programmed at an early age. It is a normal response to run from something that you fear. You have the fight-flight mechanism. You either stay there to do battle or you haul behind. And so one of the things that a child will do is run if it fears something. And so the urination, the micturition is a normal autonomic response to a fear reaction. And so the issue, though, is how much that trauma is going to affect that child for the future and maybe that child's child. And so that is what we have to begin to really address. The children are responding to what they have been programmed. The symbolism of police for the average African-American child is not positive because we don't have community policing in the classical sense. And so the child is doing a normal reaction. He's just fine. He's either running from fear because he knows that the probability is he is going to be shot, because he's seen other children his age. And there's the data that supports that black children, when they are viewed as older, even when they're the same age as white children. And so that they are more responsible. And as such, there is also the psychology of eliminating a future generation so that you don't have to compete with them again.
I was going to ask Dr. Malvo and Ms. Brown to talk a little bit more about the economic aspects that are hidden in our history. So, for example, I understand that in 1790, America was producing about 1.5 million pounds of cotton every year. And by 1860, just 70 years later, that went to 2.3 billion pounds, almost 60% of US exports at that time. Is it possible to trace economic loss and damage? Is it possible to figure out how much money was made by different individuals or companies as we wrestle with these issues? And is that important? Dr. Malvo, start with you.
Well, first of all, it is absolutely possible. There are a number of economists and forensic accountants and others that have done the work to look at which companies benefited, which insurance companies, banks, the whole bond industry is based on the backs of enslaved people. So there's a very rich body of research that looks at all of this, and you can find out who did what and who earned what, who got what. Is it important? Oh, hell yeah. Oh, forgive me, Pastor, I did it again. He gonna come up here and put some holy water on me in a minute. But the reason that it's important is because, again, we have these wealth gaps. We have these companies that are publicly traded, that are making profits. They're making profit, and their foundation was on somebody's back. Some people want to say this happened a long time ago. Well, you know, if you stole something out of my house a long time ago, and I come back and get it, that's fair. Now you might stole it, and my granddaughter comes and gets it. It's still fair. You took my stuff. And so when we begin to document these folks, and which is why the young people at Georgetown, I give them very high props for what they're doing in terms of saying they passed a tax on themselves to do reparations related activity at Georgetown. But all the Ivies, Brown, Columbia, all of them have their roots in enslavement. And it does matter because there are folks, as you said, who would like to look at enslavement as something that was Southern. You know, we have anything to do with it. Yes, you did. Not only as people who owned enslaved people, as people who participated in the shipping, who participated in every other aspect of it. And so, yes, it does make sense. Will we be made whole? I'm not going to speculate, but I'm going to say when the facts are on paper, it changes the ways that we can look at certain things. And then let me say this as well, because this is very important for us to also look at. If you look at the complexion of Black America, see, people keep telling me to do that DNA 23 stuff. I ain't looking for my white folks. I ain't looking for them. So I'm not giving anybody any spit or blood so I can find some white folks that are related to me. I am not that interested. But when slave importation stopped, the form of reproduction was white men raping Black women. That's just what it was. And we could clean it up. I mean, somebody wants to tell you that Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson were in love. Well, how do you say to Massa, Massa, I have a headache. Not tonight. I mean, I don't think you really quite get to do that. So there are other kinds of complicity that we also have to own. And the range of complexion in our community is not so much about consensual relationships between white men and Black women, but about someone's predatory capitalist need to essentially multiply the population for the benefit of exploitation. See, some of these people had no hearts or souls. They sold their children. Yeah. And they didn't mind selling their children because and they sometimes even accounted it in their books. But all of this stuff, between computers and forensic records and the census, we can document much of this. The question is how much time, effort, and energy we want to put into documenting it, how much time, effort, and energy we put into the revolutionary activity, that which I think makes us more whole when we resist enslavement, resist contemporary enslavement, resist the entirety of the predatory capitalist undermining of our country. When we do that, that makes us whole too. So I want the historians to do their work. I want us to know what's up, but I also want us to know that there are some other things we can do to repair ourselves. We will have, as Bob and Patricia has mentioned, the physiological response to that which we have experienced. Not to mention people tell you stuff, and that stuff becomes internalized.
That's right.
You know, my mom told me once, when I bought my Lexus, actually, she said, "Why would you buy a Lexus now? People will know you have money." I was like, yeah. And I wanted a red convertible my whole life, so when I got the money, I got me one. But basically, her lesson was live under the radar. You know, don't stand up, don't stand out. And when she heard that the convertible was red, she really had a fit. Yeah, she said, now the police will go stop you every day. I'm like, what's new? You know, what's new? I just cuss them out, you know, because I'm a female. Brothers can't do that. Well, you can cuss them out, they won't, well, they might. But anyway, but the bottom line is we internalize messages about our oppression. And so one of the ways we begin to unpack this is to really deal with who did what. Yeah. So if you knew that, as an example, Metropolitan Life Insurance Company was a major actor in enslavement, would you buy insurance for them? Just saying.
Sure. I guess the point I would want to make on this question is the importance of looking both at for example, the corporations or the families or the universities, the way major institutions benefited, but not to do so to the exclusion of really driving home the point that regular, everyday, average people were complicit in this system, because it's so easy for white Americans to say that they weren't like my family and to think that gets them off the hook. But when you look at everything from the factory workers at those textile mills to all the sort of forms of ancillary participation in that economy that I was talking about, and very importantly, to consumers. It's like you could not be here in this country at that time and not be buying cotton or sugar or coffee or tobacco or rice. So if you were consuming those products, you were complicit in the slave economy. And there's a way in which, if we don't emphasize that, I think it gives, in a sense, permission to those who want to deny their connection with it. The other big distancing myth is this idea of my people came after slavery, so I had nothing to do with it. And as I shared in my testimony this morning, I not only have slave trading ancestors, I have lots of ancestors. That includes German, French, Irish immigrants who came at the turn of the 19th century, 20th century, and had that classic story of working in factories, struggling, having to really work their way up. So that story of we worked hard and we came after slavery needs to be re-examined, because the whole reason people immigrated here for jobs was because there were jobs. And the whole reason there were jobs is because it was a booming economy. And the whole reason it was a booming economy is because it was built on unpaid labor. So, and that really, I think, flips the script for a lot of people. And it doesn't have to mean denying that your people worked hard and struggled, and there were plenty of people who faced anti-Semitism or anti-Catholic sentiment. So it's not to deny what they went through, but it's both and, it's not either or.
Dr. Malvo, you have one other thing.
Yeah, I want to just briefly also talk about the structure of our economy and the structure of American history. I think it's really important that we not personalize it in terms of it was this family or that person. It's an economic structure that allowed enslavement to occur. And even the concurrence of immigrants, which there was concurrence, was about the economic structure in a predatory capitalist society that allows people to extract surplus value wherever they can. And so the reality of enslavement was you were able to basically extract surplus value, and that formerly enslaved people
at the turn of the century were used as strike breakers and others essentially to suppress the wages of white immigrants, because you always have the notion that if we strike, the black folks are gonna come and take our jobs. So this pitting of people against each other around employment is as ancient as the founding of this nation. But I want us to think about structure when we think about these things, and focus on structure as opposed to, a lot of folks want to take it to a micro level, but it's really a macro structural issue.
Dr. Carruthers, I wanted to ask you if you had a comment on this, and then I have another question for you, but go ahead first.
Well, I did have a thought that bridged this conversation, which is that we also have to begin to not just do a cost-benefit analysis in terms of the economics of this, but also in terms of the psychology and the spiritual consequences of this. I think the intersection of faith and psychiatry is this pathway to healing. So when we talk about epigenetics and the consequences it has on those of us who are the victims, who have been subjected to centuries of this terror and horror, I think we also have to spend some time to assess what it means in terms of identity delusion on those who control the very systems that created this cost-benefit analysis requirement. And so when you speak about the cosmology of Africa and the past, the present, and the future, I'm thinking about this in terms as well of what it means to be human.
Yes.
So what is it about the differential cost of the soul and the spirit and the psychology of this experiment called the building of this democracy that has consequential damage on what it means about the identity, the delusional identity of persons who have been the beneficiaries of this system, of those who have dominated by virtue of their white privilege. I think that's another conversation that has to be had if we're going to have an honest conversation about reparatory justice towards transformation and not just some kind of superficial reconciliation.
Amen. Amen. Amen.
Dr. Newt, I was going to ask Dr. Carruthers another question, but I saw you writing, and so is there something you wanted to add?
No, I just said amen to the 10th power.
Dr. Carruthers, I was going to ask if you would mind addressing just for a moment, you have talked about sacred sites, and there are a plethora of Confederate monuments all over this country. Most of them, the vast majority in the South, but there are some in the North, there are some in the West, they're all over the country. Do you have a view on what those monuments mean and what is trying to be preserved by those monuments?
Well, I think in some ways it is fake news to talk about separation of religion and state. And once we have an assumption that there has always been complicity based on this nation's understanding of what it meant to be religious, then we understand that those monuments are sacred sites and extensions of that complicity. And so, you know, those prayers at the top of the boat were not the same prayers at the bottom of the boat. And as a result of that, I think we should understand that those sacred sites are differentially perceived as well. So part of the simple answer to your question is, will America face up to the truth? Will it get over its amnesia, its delusion, because there is no doubt that a requirement, a requisite for the reparatory justice would be to confront the truth of what those sites really represent and to atone for them and take them down and consecrate the taking of them down as evidence of a transformed nation.
Yeah, I agree. And not only do I agree with her, but the symbolism that gets imprinted in the mind would have to be also altered. as a result of that, because when you see those monuments, you begin to think that this is the appropriate history. And truth is whatever you believe it is, but fact is what it is regardless of what you believe. And the facts are that these represent oppressive regimes that terrorize and demonize human beings and attempted to destroy them for the benefit of profit.
So I told you, buckle your seatbelts. I would like us to thank this panel of 4 women who have given us incredible knowledge. And I'm going to turn this back over to Dr. Daniels, who is going to introduce our last presenter of the day.
If I were you, I wouldn't move, because you're getting ready to hear the preeminent public intellectual on this issue of reparations in the world today. Is everybody all right? Are y'all all right? Y'all don't sound like y'all all right now. This is the beginning of this is a great day. And we've just had another very powerful. Let's give it up again for that panel. Let's give it up for Jeffrey Robinson. And we're actually going to conclude a little early. We're moving right along. We had anticipated a time for a closure, but we're going to move that up a bit. So now it's my privilege to address you all the way from Jamaica, who thought it not robbery, as they say in the church, to take up his time to be with us today. I get this microphone straightened out. Not good at it necessarily. He is the Vice Chancellor, which in Caribbean terms means the President of the University of the West Indies, the entire system. He previously served as the President of the University of West Indies in Barbados. But we have brought him here today because he is a man who talks about having been inspired actually by the movement here in this country, particularly James Foreman, to talk about reparatory justice. A few years ago, the 15 nations of the Caribbean courageously took the step of demanding of the former colonial powers reparations for native genocide, and that was so important from a principle point of view, and African enslavement. And in so doing, they created a CARICOM Reparations Commission. And they chose as the person to lead that commission, the person who comes to address you now. And they chose him because he has the rare gift of being an extraordinary historian. Just talking to him today, he was just revealing as we were on our way up, he unpacked stuff. Story after story after story of what has happened to our people. But he also buttresses it with a narrative about what that means, and with a challenge for what it is that we must do into the future if we are to create a world where there is no exploitation by human beings by human beings. He has spoken in Cambridge. He's spoken to the European Congress. He has spoken to the House of Commons and the House of Lords. He's spoken at Harvard and Yale and all across the country. But today he has come to address you on this momentous day of a public hearing on H.R. 40 and a hearing, a forum here on healing, reconciliation and healing, and the promise for reparations for African Americans. Would you please welcome Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, the chairperson of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. Give our sisters another round of applause for that magnificent panel. I've come a long way today, and I feel like being in a pulpit. I'm not sure this is the real thing. You know, there's another place up there. Okay, folks. Allow me to say that I was born in a little Caribbean island we call Barbados. And that's important. And the importance of that will become clearer as I go along. Because Barbados was the Wall Street of slavery. And it's important to feel the significance of that. I will speak about that as I go along, because I am not here from over the waters. I am here from Barbados and Jamaica because there is a black nation. There is a black nation that runs from one end of this hemisphere to the other. There is something called Plantation America that runs from Georgia all the way to Argentina. All of us black folk, are part of Plantation America. And our experiences have been the same. Whether it was Alabama, Mississippi, Jamaica, Barbados, Brazil, it has been the same experience for all of us. And all of us are family, and I will speak about family, and I will speak about family from the point of view of Barbados, because, you know, in Barbados, when the Africans ran away and they were caught, if they were persistent offenders and they were punished, do you know what happened to them? They were sent to South Carolina. They were sent to Virginia. They were deported off the island and scattered across this country. So you and I are cousins and might very well be. But that's the nature of the history. I want to speak about that. I'm here in Washington. Do you know that George Washington, before he became the president, there was a moment when he wasn't feeling very well, and where did he go to recover? He went to Barbados with his family to relax for 2 months. So I am now here from Barbados and Washington to work this through. The history connects us all, and I wish to speak about that connection. I am the other half of Dr. Malveaux. Did you hear that, Dr. Malveaux? I'm your other half. Her discipline is economics. The historians have never been happy with the economists because the economists look at the world as it is today. The historians look at the world as it used to be. It required no imagination to realize that historians and economists ought to get together. And which is why my discipline is economic history. That's why I'm her other half. The merger of economics and history. And that brings me again to Barbados. Barbados was the first society in this hemisphere where Africans were the majority. It's the first society in the whole of the Americas where Africans were the majority. The second society in the hemisphere where Africans were the majority was South Carolina. And South Carolina was founded by Barbadian slave owners. You see the connections? South Carolina was founded by the slave owners of Barbados who wanted more room to expand and to grow. And so they took possession of South Carolina. Again, the connection. We are speaking about the economics of slavery and its legacy, and this is where I wish to discuss Malveau's analysis.
Barbados was the first place in this hemisphere where white folks realized that you could bring thousands of African folks across an ocean, place them on a farm, beat the hell out of them, and make a profit. That model, the Barbados model, became the model for the rest of this hemisphere. That you could go to West Africa, terrorize the communities there, extract thousands of persons, put them on a slave ship, bring them across an ocean for 2 months, land them on a place, drive them to hard labor, and make a profit 10 times greater than if you had invested your money in government bonds, in agriculture, and what have you. Once that model was established, it became a blueprint for every white person in this hemisphere who wanted to make a quick buck, break all the rules of humanity, drive people into the ground where mortality doesn't matter, make a profit, and become a successful citizen. Now, they were not brought across the Atlantic for show, to dance and sing. They were brought here for economic purposes, economic reasons, and we have to feel the sense of that, because unless you understand the economics of this matter, you will misunderstand the future. Now, of course, we can take you through this step by step, how it was calculated, how the analysis was made, how much you paid for a male African in West Africa, how much you paid for a female, the shipping costs across the Atlantic, the mortality costs, the landing price, the auction prices, the movement to the estate, 10 years of labor, then you die, you replace that person, increase productivity. We can take you through the economics of that process, because at the end of the day, the balance sheet had to show a profit. You're not going to go through all of that not to make a profit. It is about profit. And it is about the role of government in establishing that system to allow citizens to make that profit within the laws of the nation. The government created the framework, the legislative framework, the business framework, the trade policies, the trade laws. All of that was put in place by the government to allow citizens to maximize their profit from the employment of free African labor. The role of the government, the role of the state. The role of the state in framing and sustaining that structure for 400 years. Now, I want you to be aware and be aware of the concept which is called the national interest. The most wicked and heinous things have been done in the name of the national interest. And this is why I say this. From the moment the slave trade started, from the moment enslavement started, there were people in Europe, in this country, in the Caribbean, there were always people who were saying, this is wrong. This is criminal. This is immoral. This is sinful. All of those languages were used to describe this thing that was happening. But guess what happened? The government and its officials and supporters and the investors all said, it might be. It might be sinful. It might be criminal. It might be immoral. But guess what? it is in the national interest. And all of those folks, all of that opposition was blown away. Social morality blown away. Human values blown away. Concepts of citizenship and justice blown away, because what was coming through was the juggernaut called the national interest. And this is important because that same concept will apply in our time to the issue of reparations. That very concept is going to be dusted off and used again when the state of this country begins to look at the question of reparations. Is it in the national interest? And the question is, who will own that national interest? Who will define it? Who will be the ones who define what the national interest is? In the context of slavery, it was the royal family of Great Britain and Europe, for the merchants, the investors. Those are the ones who captured the concept of the national interest and rammed it down the throats of all of the other citizens. This is something that you will have to watch. And so here we are today, celebrating this moment in our movement. There are always seminal moments in every great movement. And today is one such moment. And there will be other moments. Some of them will be a step forward. Some of them will be 2 steps backward. But it is a movement. And it is a movement that is 400 years old. From the moment the first Africans arrived in this hemisphere, the reparations movement started. It started from day one. And it has been galloping. It has been galloping century by century. When we look at the history of this process, you realize that it took us 300 years to uproot slavery from this hemisphere. It took 300 years of struggle, 300 years of the most aggressive and focused black movement to uproot slavery from this hemisphere, and we succeeded. It took us 300 years. But we never gave up. Thousands of our people died in the process. We know the history. We know the history of the murdering of our people across the lands of this hemisphere. A day did not go by that our people were not killed in large numbers in that period. But that struggle continued until slavery was finally abolished in Brazil in the 1880s. The Haitians we know paid the greatest price. They abolished slavery with their revolution. A decade did not go by. A decade did not go by in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries unless there was a major black rebellion somewhere in this hemisphere. Somewhere in this hemisphere. Somewhere there was a major revolt of African people. Somewhere. Decade by decade by decade until we got the work done. Then it took us another 100 years to put in place fundamental civil rights. Another 100 years. From the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, another 100 years, our struggle continued for basic human rights. Another 100 years. So here we are now in the 21st century. It took us all of the 19th century to end chattel slavery. All of the 20th century to have our civil rights and our human rights legislated. Another 100 years. And now we have this 21st century ahead of us. We have this long 21st century ahead of us. And this is the century of reparations. This is it. This is it. This is it. And this is it in the United States, in Canada, in Brazil, in the Caribbean, everywhere that there was black slavery, there must be and will be reparations, because this is our focus for this century. This is our focus. And if it takes us all of this 21st century, we are going to do this, because slavery is not done until reparations is paid. Not done. And we're clear on that. We're going to focus on that. Today, we heard some very focused questions and some very intellectually sound responses to those questions in the Judiciary Committee. Let us talk about the economics, because I noticed that many members of Congress wanted to speak of the economics of this. And I want to go back to the Barbados model again as the antecedent of how this whole thing was structured and designed. Dr. Malveaux says we have to speak of structures. In 1661, the Barbados Assembly passed the first slave code of this hemisphere. The first comprehensive slave code of this hemisphere was passed in Barbados in 1661 and then implemented in South Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, everywhere else. The same template was used across this country. 1, all Africans under law are classified as property, real estate, and chattel. Because you have now been commodified, because that's the basis of the structure. The second clause, no African must be allowed to buy or sell or trade or barter any commodity whatsoever. Therein lies the beginning of economic marginalization, because the African peoples arrived from West Africa with a culture of business, trading, buying, selling, street markets. Africans were not comfortable unless they were buying and selling. It's their culture. And the women especially, carriers of this commercial culture, always buying, selling, exchanging, negotiating, bartering, commodifying things around them. The slave laws were designed to eradicate that impulse to commerce, to eradicate the impulse to commerce, to business. So what was inherent in your values, to be commercial, to be entrepreneurial, to be buying and selling, not necessarily to rip people off, but because the culture of exchange, that culture was criminalized across this hemisphere. In every state in this United States, in the Caribbean, the laws were passed to eradicate the commercial culture of the people. Obviously, the objective was to give white folks a monopoly of the economic enterprise. And that's how we lived. We were forced to be buying and selling at night, buying and selling around the corner, because you cannot eradicate a culture that has taken thousands of years to develop. You drive it underground. And so we took our economic culture underground. That's how we survived. So above ground, the white folks had the monopoly. We were underground. Imagine the impact of 400 years of that. That, Dr. Malveaux, that is the greatest crime in respect of the economic structures. And so most of the countries of the Caribbean, we fought for control of the state. And yes, the black folks are in charge of the governments of the Caribbean. We are in charge of the governments because we paid a dear price in all of those battles to fight to win control of the state. So we have the state. But now we are fighting for reparations even though we have the state, because the white folks controls the economies. All of the economies of the Caribbean, with the exception of Haiti and Antigua, are controlled by their white minority. And this is why I say, let us go back to Barbados, my homeland. Us black folks are 95% of the population. The white folks are 4%. But they control 80% of the economy. Because the white folks had the power of the British imperial government, and even though the countries of the Caribbean became independent, the economic wealth remained in the hands of the minority, with the exception of Haiti and Antigua. And I will tell you why Antigua. Emancipation came. The only place in the Caribbean where the emancipated black folks stood up and said, we are not going to work another day for white folks. All those people who have enslaved us, we are not working for them for another day. Shut it down, not working for them. After 6 months, the white folks packed up and left, went back to England. Packed up and left. All the land fell into the hands of the former slaves. So here's an island where all of the land, all of the property fell into the hands of the former slaves. And that is why Antiguans today are so bad. They behave very badly. Very badly. Just a few weeks ago, Scotia Bank, the largest bank in the Caribbean, the Canadian Bank of Scotia, Nova Scotia, decided to sell out all of their banks in the Caribbean. They're moving on. They're going to Brazil. The Caribbean is too small. The market is too small. We're not going to make no money in the Caribbean. We're going south. We're going to Brazil, where there's lots of folks. And we're selling out all of our banks. They put them on the market. The only government that stood up and said, back off. You cannot sell your banks on this island because the people of Antigua have been working for these banks for 50 years. You cannot take those banks. Those banks belong to us, Antigua. No other country said that, Antigua. That's the mentality that has emerged out of Antigua because the people took a decision 150 years ago, it is over. Out. Now, and so the Antigua government said, and furthermore, we are going to fund a 3-day conference on international banking and slavery. Because they're drawing the connection between what the banks are doing today and what they did 200 years ago, because all of these major global banks began their journey in slavery, funding the slave trade, financing the slave trade, mortgages on the enslaved Africans. The banking system is up to its neck in maintaining the economic structure. Antigua has now said they're going to have a 3-day symposium to speak about all of this. Why? Because they have the intellectual confidence to say so and to do so. Today, I reflected on a conversation we had in Durban in 2001 at the UN conference, and many of you folks were there. And we were there from all over the world, folks in search of justice. And we came away from Durban with one fundamental conclusion, that the greatest political movement of the 21st century is going to be the global reparations movement. This is going to be the greatest movement of the 21st century. And we said that 17 years ago, 18 years ago. And we are now warming up to this. About 6 months ago, we held a conference in Benin. And we called the African chiefs and African kings to the conference. And we sat down in Benin City with about 20 of these African kings who are the descendants and the heirs to the kingdoms of West Africa that were ravished and destroyed by slavery and the slave trade. And they were happy to be there. They've been getting a pretty bad press. But they see themselves as survivors. Yes, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, going back to the 1750s, was king when the Dutch pulled up in the harbor. They were given choices. They were given choices. You know, you don't negotiate with people who are weaker than yourselves. You just have to turn on your television and listen to the news. You don't negotiate. In the Western world, you don't negotiate with people who are militarily weak. You tell them what to do or else. That's the model. These kings were told, deliver 6,000 folks per year in the harbor, or you and your kingdom will disappear. Now, I had the honor as a student, a graduate student, to prepare a dissertation on the world's first multinational slave trade corporation, the Royal African Company of England, incorporated in the city of London in 1672. The chairman of the board of directors was King James. All of the other directors were members of his family and their supporters. In other words, the English aristocracy. The mandate of the company was to supply 8,000 Africans to the colonies of Barbados, Antigua, St. Kitts, and Jamaica, and later on, South Carolina, on an annual basis. The company kept remarkable records. And in those records are the occasional reference to assassinate the king of this country or that country. Because the king is mobilizing his people against the slave trade. You cannot take my people, you cannot pass through my country. We are against this. The leader of the company, the chairman of directors, writes a letter to London that King X is opposing the interests of the company. Response comes back from London, and it comes back from Whitehall. The British government sends back the response: assassinate him. I want you to understand the interconnections between business and politics and warfare. We have documents illustrating that African leaders were targeted for extermination because they stood in the way of this trade. And who were the owners of the stock? The royal family as we know it today. All of that wealth has come all the way down. A few years ago, I published a book entitled Britain's Black Debt, Reparations for Slavery. And on the cover of that book is a photograph of Queen Elizabeth II visiting her cousin's sugar plantation in Barbados in 1966. That plantation had been in the royal family from 1732. From 1732 Lord Hayward and the Hayward family that married into the royal family owned that estate in Barbados. Even after Barbados, this is not after emancipation, this is after independence. And the royal family still owning a sugar estate on my home island, Barbados. I want you to understand the immediacy of this. The point was made earlier. You know, Chairman McConnell, what did he say? Oh, it was a long time ago. Is that what he said? It was a long time ago. Not for me. It wasn't a long time ago. For me, it was yesterday, because on my island of Barbados, I grew up seeing properties owned by the royal family. It is amazing. It is truly amazing. This is today. And allow me to say this. I'm coming to an end. The institution of slavery might be over, but we are now in the jet stream of its consequences. We are in the jet stream of it. Last week, I had the honor and privilege of being a part of the welcoming of the president of Ghana to Barbados. The president of Ghana comes to an island in the Caribbean that was populated by the citizens of Ghana. Because when the British were developing Barbados as their first slave plantation, they were taking the Africans out of the Gold Coast. 600,000 Africans, mostly from the Gold Coast, were imported into Barbados. Now, I want you to do the numbers. Do the numbers. A small island imports 600,000 Africans over the period of the slave trade. And today, the population of Barbados is 280,000. How do you import 600,000 people onto an island, and after 200 years, there are only 280,000 remaining? At emancipation, there were 84,000 Africans on the island. 600,000 imported. At emancipation, 84,000. 10-12% survival. What do you call that? That is genocide. That is genocide. So when we are speaking about enslavement of our people in this hemisphere, it is enslavement and genocide. You don't import 600,000 people. Jamaica imported over 3 million. At emancipation, there were 300,000. Genocide. And so the claim we are making in CARICOM against the governments of Europe is not just enslavement. Yes, we're also making a claim for the genocide of Native and the genocide of African people in the Caribbean. Why? Because that was their intention. It was their explicit economic model. Because, again, let us run the numbers. You run the numbers. Let's say you go down Bridgetown, Kingston, Port of Spain, Jamestown, New York City, Rose Island, wherever. You buy an African off the market for 40 pounds. The bidding goes, bum. Yes, sir, you, 40 pounds. Okay, you buy your African for 40 pounds and take it home. You're going to work that African 20 hours a day, every day, and you're going to work that 40 pounds out of him or her within about 6 months. That African is going to live maybe another 20 years. So you get 1 year out of him, out of her, you get your money back, the rest is pure profit. That's the model. So the model is work to death and replace. Work to death and replace. And that is why you have the constant replacement, constant replacement. Because the business model is based upon purchase, exploit, and replace. The worst thing you would wish to have on your estate, on your plantation, is an old Negro. An old what? The concept of an old Negro is a contradiction to the business model. But you know, black folks are going to live long anyway. Just a few weeks ago, we had this remarkable story in Jamaica. This lady was 117 years old, the oldest person in the world. 117. And her son died at 97. And the media, you know, they went up to her and they say, well, Mrs. Brown, how do you feel about the death of your son? She said, well, he was always a sicky child. Now, the sicky child died at 97. But she wasn't surprised he did. It was always a sicky child. But we survive. And this is who we are. We are the descendants of survivors of the Holocaust. This is who we are. And survivors come to the world. Survivors come to the world with a very specific mindset. And that mindset is what has brought us through. And we are now digging our heels in for justice. And today was a wonderful moment in our movement. We have now built reparations committees across West Africa. We now have reparations committees in Europe. Just 2 months ago, the European Parliament had a special sit-in on reparations. Very similar to what we had here today, the European Parliament had a sit-in and passed a resolution unanimously that all member nations of Europe must establish reparatory justice frameworks and policies to begin the dialogue. And so, we have established frameworks and negotiations at the government level in the Caribbean. The framework now exists in the European Union. We have a similar framework in Colombia. We had a similar framework in Venezuela and Costa Rica. And now we are moving to establish those frameworks across West Africa. The president of Ghana signed a framework agreement in which he said, the University of the West Indies and the University of Ghana will enter into a process of reparatory justice, and he is making resources available to the Faculty of Medicine so that African students will travel to the Caribbean, Caribbean students travel to Africa to study medicine, and the focus of that program is chronic diseases, hypertension and diabetes. Because guess what? The majority of Africans in Barbados are from Ghana. Barbados has now become known not only as a beautiful place to have a holiday, which it is. Barbados in the medical circles is known as the amputation capital of the world. And this is why I come back to Barbados every time. More amputations caused by complications of diabetes take place in Barbados per capita than in any other country in the world. Why? Because Barbados is where this crime started, slavery. And this is why I come full circle. So yes, slavery is abolished, but now 60% of all the black citizens in Barbados have hypertension, diabetes, or both. And now with the highest incidence of diabetes-induced amputations. You cannot separate the history from the present. It is the history that has brought this language and this reality into the present time. And yes, there isn't a family, there isn't a black family in Barbados that isn't riddled with hypertension or type 2 diabetes. Now, fast forward and ask yourself, why is it not the case in Ghana? If you take people from one place and bring them to another place, 200 years later, you run the numbers, the ones on this side are chronically diseased, and the ones from where they came is not. There is nothing disturbing to the medical fraternity in Ghana about hypertension, diabetes. They have that under control. And if they have that under control, why is it that the people who came from that same place with the same DNA don't have it under control? Something has happened in between. And what is that? Slavery, colonization, racism, white supremacy, mental stress. Nana gave it to you. The psychological and spiritual disalignment and the disease of disease. All of that. That is what reparations is for. That's what it's for. How you destroy the minds and bodies of a people because you find them to be vulnerable. Because you find them to be vulnerable. And guess what? You did it for 400 years because you had the power to do it. Not only because it enriched you, but because you had the military power to do it. I will tell you something. When the emancipation bills were being discussed in the British Parliament in the 1830s, there were two sets of data placed before the British Parliament. One set of data showed that slavery had become uneconomical, that the price of sugar had collapsed, the price of cotton had collapsed, the price of buying and selling Africans had gone through the roof, and if you have rising labor prices and falling sale revenue, you have a very unprofitable situation. All of the economic data said this thing is no longer financially sustainable. Stop it. The slave owner says, no, we cannot stop it because we are addicted to it. That's the difference. Even though we know it is not profitable, this plantation is costing me all of my savings, my reserves is wiping me out, but I cannot get rid of it because I am addicted to it. I want you to imagine the power of the slave owner. The power to take life when you wish with no consequences. To take the bodies of black women as you wish because they are your property. There is no law that says you can rape property. The power. You know, one of the first books I wrote as a young academic was on the enslavement of African women. And one of the surveys I did, I studied 4,000 plantations across the region. And I looked at the average age of the mother of a mulatto child. Now that, I looked at the birth of all the mulatto children, and I looked at the ages of their mothers. The average age of a black woman who gave birth to a mulatto child was 13. 13. 13 was the average age of a black female that gave birth to mulatto children. And this is why they were addicted. The social power of being a slave owner. We do this because all of those young girls, they deserve justice. All of those young girls. And I will end where I started. This brother here with all the afro, stand up and show me the afro, man. Yes, you don't. Yeah, stand up and show me the afro. That is how I looked when I was your age, man. I'm saying to you, enjoy it while it lasts, man. Enjoy it while it lasts. You know, I tell you this. When I was a teenager, all of my brothers, we had a choice. You could either grow an afro or you could grow dreadlocks. All the boys who grew afros went bald, and all the boys who grew dreadlocks still have hair. So it's interesting, I don't know why. So we are building a global movement, and we are here. And today was a glorious movement, a glorious moment. I sat there and I listened. Ron, I wish to thank you for arranging to allow me to be here. I appreciate that gesture because this is how our movement interacts. As I said to you earlier, when we in CARICOM developed the 10-point plan for reparatory justice, we developed that 10-point plan because we had studied once again James Foreman's analysis of reparations. So we were inspired in the islands by him here. And this is how we go. We take care of each other. We're part of the same process. I want to thank you for this invitation. I know that some moment in the next month or two, I will write a paper about this, and I will share it with you. And Dr. Malvo, you were spot on today. You were spot on. We're going to bring you down the islands to do all of this all over again. Say it, down the islands all over again. So, brothers and sisters, thank you for participating in this process. You are the troops that we will need to get this work done. So stand in solidarity, and we will achieve what is God's work to be achieved. Thank you.
Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, who tells the story. Well, we're just about done. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee is on her way. So will you wait for Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee to close us out? Will you wait for Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee to close us out? All right. We thinned a little bit because people do have obligations. People do have things that they have to do. But the person who has taken the torch from the Honorable John Conyers is the Honorable Sheila Jackson Lee, and she is on her way. So what we thought we would do, Jeff and I have some things to sort of close with. And by the time we close, hopefully, our Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee will be here. Let me grab my notes. First of all, some of you did not get the 10-point program. This pamphlet, so we want to make sure on your way out that you get a copy of it. We brought plenty of them, but somehow some of you did not get a copy. Or the people who did not get a copy, raise your hand if you did not get a copy. Okay, we want to make sure that you get a copy leaving out. They're on the back table. The other thing we want to do is, it is important that we have progressive media that is willing to share this program. And so we have to give a thunderous round of applause to WPFW for carrying this program. WPFW, right? A round of applause for WBAI up in New York on the Pacifica Network that's carrying this program. And Pastor Mike, Pastor Mike he's in between. He's bridging the civil rights generation and the hip hop generation, but he's here. He's a dear friend of mine. He's with the Live Free network of the Faith in Action Network initiative. Give it up for Pastor Mike, because they're also like tweeting and sharing it all over the place. We thank you so much for that. We also have to thank the University of West Indies Television, because they're also carrying this program. And of course, we can't thank the ACLU enough. Now, quickly, let me just say that also, we do want to thank again, this is a historic church. President Obama came here. President Clinton came here. I mean, this church houses some of the most important people and initiatives in the world. I was just here recently with Mel Foote from the constituency from Africa, when we honored the Honorable Ronald Retelling right here in this church. And so we just have to also not only thank Pastor Lamar again, let's give it up for Pastor Lamar. But also, there's somebody in this church who really makes these things happen. She's my boss. I've come to meet her and know her. And she just worked with us and pulled everything together. So Mrs. Lucille Knowles, would you please stand up? Please stand up. Let's give it up for Mrs. Lucille Knowles. She's the one who really, really, really worked every detail to make sure that this happened. It's always important to do that, because sometimes you just brush over people. This would not have happened without the engagement of the staff. I also just want to say that we're truly delighted to have had this incredible occasion. I also got to give a shout out to somebody who came all the way. I didn't realize she was here, but she's the founder of the Voting Rights Museum. And there's a whole lot that goes down in Selma, Alabama. And Professor Beckles, you have to go to Selma for the Jubilee. You have to go to Selma. So Faya Rose Teray is in the audience. Faya Rose Teray, the founder of the Voting Rights Museum, and the Bridge Crossing Jubilee that commemorates Bloody Sunday. So, Jeff, I'm going to pass it to you for any final comments you have as we wait for the Congresswoman to come in. Then you can segue it back to me. I have a few more things to say as well. But I have to say this, that we in the Institute of the Black World 21st Century, and I think I speak for the entirety of the National African American Reparations Commission, are truly delighted to be a part of a partnership, not only with the ACLU, but let me just say also with the conscious. You see, let me say this. There are people who are all over the place who might be black, who might be in institutions. They are of the race, but not necessarily for the race. What we need in these institutions are people who are of the race and for the race, who are in institutions. I was with the Center for Constitutional Rights for 12 years, and sometimes it was not easy dealing with the good white people. It can be rough sometimes, because this bias is in our bones, right? And so you have to struggle sometimes. But we are so delighted Jeffrey, and all of the people who work with you, that we are working with you in this initiative. So please give it up again for Jeffrey Robinson, the Deputy Legal Director of the ACLU. Give it up. Give him a big hand.
Thank you, folks. I'm hoping the Congresswoman shows up because I think she wants to come here to acknowledge both the importance of this day and the importance of this forum. The only real thing, excuse me, that I have to say as we close out is a repeat of something I said at the beginning. This is a special day and a special location and a special event, but it is not the only event. This is the first of a series, and we hope to take what we have learned in putting this event on to make the next event better, and the event after that better, and the event after that better. And the one goal that we have, and now I speak for the ACLU, the one goal that the ACLU has is to bring the voices of people like the people that you saw on this panel today to the broadest section of America possible. And I honestly believe that if people start to listen to folks like the folks we had on this podium today, then conversations about reparations are not going to be fringe conversations. And answers to people like Mitch McConnell will be loud and effective. So I want to thank you for coming. I know it's been a long afternoon, but as I said before, we plan on going forward with this with NAARC, with other organizations led by impacted leaders, and we hope to have an impact on what America does on this issue. So Ron, come back up. I'm going to walk back there and walk downstairs and see if I see the Congresswoman and see if I can get her up here as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Right. But she's on the way. We know that she's definitely on the way. Let me just make a couple of observations in terms of what I've heard today, because I like to dabble in this a little bit too. And I particularly was struck by the economic analysis that was brought both by the documentarian for the Traces of a Trade, as well as Dr. Malvo and others. Because really, what happens in American history is that not only do we have the miseducation of black folks in America, we have the miseducation of everyone in America. I mean, how else could you still have about 40% of the people, or 36 or whatever it is, supporting the orange man? I mean, how could you figure that out, given all of the realities of the people who do that are often people who are suffering themselves? But it is so important for people to understand the intergenerational deficits of exclusionary policies and the intergenerational benefits for those who actually were able to take advantage of that which happened in terms of enslavement and those things that happened afterwards. And I heard the whole notion of the immigrants who came. And we were sitting here talking about the relationship between the South and the North and cotton and all of that. And that political economy is often not laid out. It didn't matter that the South lost the war, so to speak. What happened was the new regime in the South, and it was a new regime. In fact, the war was fought to change the nature of the South, because really the old plantation system was outmoded. They wanted a new kind of system. And in that system, having emancipated but suppressed labor was better than having enslaved labor. And so when you look at that, you're up north, you happen to be white, you're in a textile mill. There's a direct relationship between, in fact, the cotton being picked by black people in terms of sharecroppers, being sharecroppers and agricultural laborers in the South, and that cotton going north to go into those into those textile mills. In fact, the other reality is she talked about the fact that there were jobs that the immigrants could come to work in. But check this out. Yes, we were enslaved in the South, 3.5 million of us. She talked about the fact that those jobs, these white people who came, were being brutalized. I mean, it was no picnic. They were being oppressed, those also, but they were being oppressed in factories, foundries. You see what I'm saying? They were being oppressed in area that was much better, even relatively speaking, than being a sharecropper or an agricultural laborer in the South, where you could make no money. So what happened? There was a choice made. 13 million immigrants came in from Europe. 13 million to work in those factories, the foundries, and the mines for wages that were in fact below what they ought to have been, because in fact the white folks who were in charge didn't care whether they were black or white. They were ruthlessly exploiting these white folks as well. But it was much better than being a sharecropper in the South. And so we were held deliberately in the South. And then those folks up north who were in those factories and those mines, they could pass on intergenerationally that grub state to their sons and daughters in a way that we could not. That's why the commission is important, because that story needs to be told. And it's not just ancient history. I'm from Youngstown, Ohio, a steel town, used to be steel town. I shall never forget in 1956, the Hungarian revolt that took place. Youngstown's a steel town. My father is a steel worker. And by the way, he also worked in the mines in West Virginia under John L. Lewis and so forth. But in that era, people forget that if you were a black worker in the steel mill, you could only work, if there were 10 grades, you could only work the first 4 grades. You couldn't work the grades at the top. You were locked into the dirtiest, filthiest jobs in the labor gang at the bottom. In 1956, when the Hungarian revolt took place, in Youngstown, Ohio, they have, in the 4th Ward and the 7th Ward, quote unquote, the Slavic wards. The immigrants came from Eastern Europe. And guess what? They were able to come in and work not in grade 1 through 4. They got the jobs 6 through 10. Not in ancient history, in my lifetime, in my memory. They came in and they were able to get those jobs that my father and others of his ilk could not work in up north, up south, in the steel mills. Now, what will happen is those people will say, well, I had nothing to do with this reparations thing. I didn't benefit. I don't know what this is all about. But of course, they were the beneficiaries of, in fact, being able to get wages at a level higher than those who were locked at the bottom. Truth also be told, if you look at the whole question of Jim Crow in the South, when people start talking about affirmative action, and it was also mentioned today in one of the presentations, this whole question of fusion, I think, was mentioned. Yes, there was fusion in the South, because for one rare moment after Reconstruction, there was, of course, post-Reconstruction. There was the sellout, there was the betrayal that took place. But what is not studied sufficiently is the people who took charge in the South actually cut a deal. They said, take the federal troops out and all that, but we will take care of the black folks. If you go back and read C. Van Whitworth's The Strange Career of Jim Crow, particularly his article on mud cells and bottom rails, they talk about the fact that they preferred black people to those dirty, filthy white folks. They called them white trash. This is the power elite white in the South talking about white people. But what happened is those white people, those workers and farmers, actually began to unite with black farmers and workers in something called the populist movement. And for one rare moment, that coalition challenged the power structure in the South, and they almost overturned this new white power structure in the South. One of the reasons it failed, because at the end of the day, those in power began to appeal to their kith and kin, something like this. Why are you allying yourself with these darkies, with these N-words, folks? We're all white people. We should all be together. We should all be, why would you do that? And then Watson, Tom, they begin to they begin to compromise. They begin to weave and wobble a little bit. And so what the white power structure did, Jim Crow was not just some mythical bird. Jim Crow was the psychological and material benefits to ensure that black folks and white folks never come together again in terms of challenging the commanding heights of power in the South or anywhere else. And here's what they did. They said, look, we will make sure, white folks, that since we love you, and since we're all in this together, there will be bathrooms that will be set aside just for you. So you'll have your own bathrooms. There will be water fountains so that you don't have to drink the same after all, you don't want to drink with them folks from Africa and all these inferior. So you'll have your own water fountains. And if you have to go on these conveyances, we'll make sure there's some special seats just for you. And even in the graveyards, there's a danger that if we don't want you in the same graveyard as black folks because it just, that might leach over and some of that stuff might just. And so they gave them the psychological benefits, a psychological buy-in. But just in case that didn't work, we're going to go a step further. To my white kith and kin, there are going to be certain jobs, because we love you. We like you. We don't want you to feel betrayed by us. We're all in this together. There will always be certain jobs that are what? Set aside. And I use my language deliberately. Certain jobs set aside just for you, poor white folks. Just for you, because we love you. And we don't want you to have to be dangling around and messing around with them. With them darkies and jungle bunnies, right? And they say, well, just in case there's a shortage and you have to work the same job, we will always make sure that what? You will be paid more than they are. This was, in fact, what? A huge affirmative action program for white people. It's how you have to look at it. And when you look at that in terms of, again, the intergenerational benefits and the intergenerational deficit, you see how across generations, black people were held back, but those who had those benefits, even in a system where white folks were also being oppressed, the level of oppression was less, and so therefore they could benefit to a degree that we were not able to benefit. But the bottom line is that a wedge was driven. And Professor Sir Hilary Beckles talked about it. He said, how odd is it that even after the system does not work anymore, people were willing to buy into it simply for the cultural value of it. So then look at the programs in the 60s and the 70s. There were white people who believed that food stamps and those benefits were in fact just accruing to, they felt they were accruing more to black folks than white folks, when in reality, there were more white folks benefiting from those programs than ever before. But that wedge was driven in. And so we also have to overcome that as we move forward. Now, I see the chief of staff for the congressman is in the house, so that means that she is on her way. I assume she's on the way up the steps and about to enter the house, and she is here. And so y'all forgive me for having to do my little filibuster, but I hope it has some value, in terms of just laying out my thoughts on the question, because we just had to have a bridge, across the waters to connect to the lady, the woman, the champion who is going to lead and is leading us on this struggle for reparations to conclude our broadcast that's carried by WBAI, that's being carried by WPFW, that's being carried by Live Free Network, that's being carried by the University of West Indies Television, a global leader from Houston, Texas. Would you please welcome the Honorable Sheila Jackson Lee. Sheila Jackson Lee.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much. Thank you for coming today to ensure that the circle of history is complete with this great coalition and the commission and the work that you have been doing, and that your work is not in vain. And so allow me to give my appreciation to the coalition that is here, the organization formulated so that all voices could be heard, and Dr. Ron Daniels in the work that you've done with my predecessor, the Honorable John Conyers. Would you give all of them a very large applause, and yourselves? I will not keep you long, but I will try to put in the moment what you have done today. And I will use it in the context of what you have done. One of the great aspects of your coalition is that there are people in this room whose history is not mine. And there are people in this room who do not look like me. And that is the very character of what we will need as we move forward in the United States Congress. You broke through today. You broke through today. Your toiling in the vineyards has made a powerful impact. The hearing was seen around the halls of the United States Congress. Media clanged and clung and hung on to every word. They gathered in the hallways to ask the question about reparations. And members of Congress who were not in the room were watching it on television. Today, we spoke truth to power, and we set the journey forward for what I hope you will join me on, is to insist, with all appreciation to the leadership, let me call their names, of the committee, of that subcommittee. That was a subcommittee. Dr. Daniels knows it was not the full committee. So it was a subcommittee. And the reason why you might have seen me at the end, because I squeezed on to the committee, the very end. And I was glad to do so. Because of my leadership on the Criminal Justice Committee, I had to squeeze on to that committee. And I didn't care, as Ron Dellums and Pat Schroeder told me when they went on the Armed Services Committee way back when, you know those names, right? Anybody know, when they know Ron Dellums, Pat Schroeder, you should know her, that the chairman of that committee said, welcome, the two of you will sit in the same seat. Now, y'all don't seem to understand that. They did. This is your chair, that's all we have, so the both of you, woman, white woman, and black man, two of the first woman, first black man, you sit in that chair. So when it came to the Constitution Subcommittee, if I had to sit on the floor, I was going to get on the committee. Please understand that, all right? So that is why I'm there, but where you are does not mean what you do. And from the moment I got on the committee, I began to talk about getting a hearing for H.R. 40. And I am grateful that we are where we are today. But I want to get back to the point that you really woke up the American psychic. You have members on both sides of the aisles talking about H.R. 40. And that is a powerful, powerful presence. Now we have the door open for the nation to pour through. Because I am determined that we are at the right time and the right moment and the significant moment in history where if we don't band together to be louder than white racists, white nationalists, and Nazis, then who are we? We have gotten our moment. We have gotten our moment. Now, we have come from different walks of life. I can hold my hand as a fist in the air and honor those. I am not making any choices. Good, my brother. I'm not picking one over the other. I need a coalition that is mighty and forceful. I need voices of the same. We are now on one agenda in this arena. I'm not suggesting that we don't have many, Dr. Daniel, agendas in many different arenas. For example, in many states, as we put together the message of where we are today. But right now, the mechanical message is we want a markup in the Judiciary Committee. That is the legislative process. Or we want them to say the bill is fine as it is, goes through committee, and then goes to the floor of the House. Now, I may not be hearing correctly. I'm hearing a lot of things. I have some other points to say. How are you? I have a lot of things that have been going across my desk, but as I was leaving, somebody said, the majority leader said if it comes out of the House, the Judiciary Committee, it'll get a floor vote. That's already printed in the newspaper. I know he was going to get up on that one. That's the majority leader of the House to get it out. And then there was some further comments made by the majority leader in the Senate. I frankly believe with a surge of powerful voices, why shouldn't the Senate vote on a study in a commission? Why is that anti-American? Why, if we don't come as a surge of a multicultural group saying that this moment in time, 250 years, now translated to the disparate treatment today, and the actors like Dylan Hunt and Mother Emanuel, or the actor like the ones who couldn't stand for two African Americans to shop for groceries in the Midwest, or those who would look at Trayvon and look at Jordan and look at Tamir, instead of seeing loving children, they saw black faces that were expendable and that might have reflected in how we were treated in slavery when we were chattel and property. And when I began to recount those stories on the floor of the House, people recounted modern day circumstances. We are smaller numbers in early childhood education, meaning African American children, but we're higher numbers in suspensions as you go through school. I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but what I'm trying to create for you is a pathway in which we advocate that there is no other path but to pass this bill and to get it on any president's desk to sign into law and to begin this process. Some call it healing, some call it reparations and reconciliation, but it is destined by its mission in the legislation, which is not featherweight. It is directed to deal with the historical brutality and racism and de jure and de facto impact of slavery, which carries us to 2019, the year of return. So if I came by here today, and I'm grateful for your waiting and listening, let me make sure that I add appreciation to names that you all know, or you would say, are they part of the family? And remember what I said when I came here. It is a task of the heroes and sheroes in this room, the journey makers in this room, to now go out to the highways and byways and draw in the most massive group of supporters. So let me thank Reverend Al Sharpton. As you well remember, asked those 15 presidential candidates that one question that has catapulted this to the national psychic. Reverend Jesse Jackson has been working on this in years past, will have a statement submitted and sends his very best. You know the champion that Danny Glover has been, and I know that he got here. And what a historical and powerful statement of the lineage of tracing it back to his heritage in slavery. And then let me thank publicly John Lennon in his past. And so you know I must have had a long day, but we honor him. He had some great music. And may he rest in peace. But let me honor John Legend, who represents the 21st century reach. Because voices that are at the level of international prominence, no matter what their art, can help draw people and make them feel comfortable in something that we have become part of our hearts. And so we put his statement in the record, but I will read just part of it. Among other things, he said, H.R. 40 is a critical, first of its kind piece of legislation. It will go beyond exploring the economic implications of slavery and segregation. It will serve as a holistic inquiry to address the gaping wound in the soul of America, one that demands to be healed now. He speaks about slavery. He speaks about the importance of moving this in order to address the ills that we have faced in this nation. And the ills are not falling only on African Americans. Forgive me if I have this reach, but it would be welcoming if our friends on the other side of the aisle, that's the terminology we use in Congress. Everybody is a friend on the other side of the aisle. Then you know that my friend on the other side of the aisle, for them to open their eyes. Because maybe some of them were the descendants of indigent servants. Maybe some of them lost their land, the small pieces that they had, and they gathered up the land by the powerful landowners, and they used slaves, and they didn't have a job. Maybe they can understand that they are living in conditions that if there was a systemic change to deal with the crisis that we find African American communities in, that their boat would lift as well. Maybe we could be less divisive. I'm going to use every approach of logic to say, why are you against this commission? Why are you against it? Why are you against it? Why are you against a rational approach to a vile act and a vile history? Now, I need not say to you that the historians will tell you of the glorious time of Reconstruction. The South Carolina legislature was all African American, all freed slaves. We were in the Congress, we were in the Senate, we were in governor's houses, 12 years. But we were propelled. Who knows if the stigma of racism and slavery had been unshackled? We continued on that path. We assumed our rightful place moving into the 20th century. We got the Harlem Renaissance. We fought in World War I with dignity, and we were respected when we came out. We then went on to World War II, and we stood up as we did, but we were respected. And when we came out, all of the benefits, dealing with housing, GI Bill, Social Security, came unto us. It did not. At the crushing of the Reconstruction, what you had is the reign of terror. Why is that not easy to understand? Why is it so difficult to understand when it was clear we did not have a chance to even look up? The reign of terror, the hanging fruit, the Ku Klux Klan, the horrific oppression, and Brother Coates did an anecdotal story, it wasn't anecdotal, it was true, of a prosperous family. Anybody remember that red buggy? Y'all got to read that article. Prosperous family. And because of the prosperity of this black family, they had more than one buggy, by the way. They had a red buggy, that was the pretty buggy, and then they had the other buggy that they'd go into town and pay their money and get their groceries, and their business was going and thriving. And they just couldn't take it. And they wound up in utter despair that was grabbed away. I'm going to use it, fibbing about the taxation. This was in the 1900s, the teens, and then into the 1920s. And all that they had was systematically taken away from the county in which they lived, which I believe was Mississippi, they wound up heading on up to Chicago, desperate to try to survive. Everything they owned, the goodness of the ability to hire people and their business taken away. And that kind of vileness continued until we thought we had a resurgence of Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965, and we're now in 2019, the year of return, 400 years since slaves were actually left the coast. We find ourselves facing Charlottesville, Charleston, and for those of us on Homeland Security, the uptick of domestic terrorism, which really results in the attack on people of color, Muslims, immigrants, is on the rise. Wouldn't it be amazing and powerful for this legislation to be the singular significant healing vehicle for this nation? Why would you be against a healing pathway for this nation? So what do we need? And by the way, let me just throw this figure out, which is 10 to 15 million, I put this in the record, Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic between 1500 and 1900, some of which went to the Caribbean, and I'm delighted that you are here. Stand again for the Caribbean Coalition for Reparations. We are delighted. That's all right, you can stand for the brother over here, yes, thank you. See, that's what I'm saying. We do not need divide, we need unity. We don't need to say he came from there and someone else came from somewhere. If we knew our history, though this legislation is the United States, but we know our history now. So we know what happened in the Caribbean. And it said 1500. Our slaves came in 1619, so they were dropping them off a little earlier, all right? Let's understand that. But I think I want to conclude with this. The action item, beyond the work that you will do in your respective communities, of educating the public from all walks of life about the rightness of righting the wrong, and that the connection to history is not associating all of us with yesteryear. Well, those are the old fogey stuff that people talk about, slavery. We're not associating with the yesteryear out of our inability to understand the future. We are building on yesteryear because it is a period of which not one of us should ever forget. And as we build on that, then our message is that the United States of America now has its duty and time to be able to repair, rejuvenate, restore. Right now, that vehicle is H.R. 40. It does not deny or quash any other efforts. I'm not going to stop local school boards from doing what they need to do in educational equality. We're not going to stop Rice University from putting together their own committee to deal with the segregation and slavery of which they built themselves on. We're going to applaud the Georgetown University students who recognize that Georgetown's doors are open because they sold property that happened to be human beings, and that the descendants of those individuals still live, and we need to repair them. I'm not going to discuss discussions at Harvard and other universities, discussions at Yale, discussions in your communities and neighborhoods. But the vehicle now to ascend to a moment that the world can watch, the world that still fights with the devastation of slavery. Although we ended slavery with the 13th Amendment, we fight every day in Foreign Affairs Committee and to deal with slaves being held around the world. America has always been known, in spite of the ups and downs, as a defender of principles, as a voice that should capture the worn, oppressed, and disenfranchised based on our Constitution. To pass H.R. 40 is the beginning of a commission that will not be in silence, because we will be insistent that part of that commission be the activists and the folk who have taken the journey, the folk who understand it, so that we will be working not to placate, but to get real solutions that can be implemented. And lo and behold, there might be a major catastrophic change in this nation. We'll only go, though, if there is no ceasing. There's no silence. There's no, I'm too busy. There's no, it's taking too long. I forgot about it. For if we have this moment, this confluence of a powerful House committee, a leader of the House saying, I'll put it on the floor, the potential of the Senate cracking and understanding, as I said in my interview, I just asked the leader to read the bill. If there is a rational thinking, I asked my friends on the other side of the aisle, so why are you against a commission? And I'm hoping that they will think about it. And then it'll be up to us, as the commission is established, to pour into it the idea of the next pathway for a generation of people who waited long and hard. I end on this note. One of my predecessors, the Honorable Mickey Leland, in 1988, filed the bill for a museum on slaves. The 18th Congressional District. It's so uncanny how things connect. Another one of my predecessors, the Honorable Barbara Jordan. But Mickey filed this bill, and in 1989, Mickey lost his life on the side of an Ethiopian mountain. And he explained to those of us who were his loyal constituents, when someone said, well, there's some folk down the block that are hungry. Mickey would say, well, I'm not ignoring the folk down the block, but I know they could make a way, and someone will make a way to them. The brothers and sisters in Eritrea, there is no pathway, there is no way. And if I don't take up their cause, nobody else is. And so I entreat you, like Ruth, to not leave me. I entreat you not to leave H.R. 40, and I entreat you not to divide, because we've come from different walk paths. Because that'll be the very cause of folks saying they weren't serious. They're not going to move forward. I've already got a few folk off in the corner saying something that they don't even want this to go forward. And then I want to do this in the name of all of your ancestors. Grandmother and grandfather. And if you're born, I don't care whether your parents were married or not, everybody got a grandmother and grandfather somewhere, somehow. They got a great-grandmother and grandfather somewhere, somehow. And great, and on. Do it in the name of those who sometimes walked every day to clean someone else's house, face the indignity of stepping off the sidewalk, couldn't even whistle, not at anybody in particular, but be a 13-year-old boy like Emmett Till, 14, and just want to be whistling in the sky, and somebody said, you were whistling at me. Do it in the name of maybe the frustration of your mother and father that you might see, if you got a little age on you, how they struggled to make ends meet in a segregated America in the 50s and 40s. Do it in their name. Do it in the name of the jobs they could have had, but they didn't have them, but they did the best they could with whatever they had. Do it in their name. When we were fighting the Iraq War, we said, not on my watch, but I'll change it now. Do it in their name. Because as I step away from this mic, I'm doing it in the name of Ezra Clyde Jackson, a young, brilliant cartoonist who left high school and went immediately to New York's Madison Avenue in the midst of World War II. His widowed mother had 4 boys. 3 went off to World War II. As the law would have it, the young one was left in case nobody came back. And he was the sole support, besides her work in somebody else's home. There he was, wearing that suit for the first time, zoot suit, by the way, going down to do his brilliant cartoons. His work is in the Smithsonian, the African American Culture and History Museum. And when those young men came back, it did not look like him. He was immediately, precipitously, with no pausing, fired for the rightful owners of those jobs to take them. And I honor him as my dad. I wasn't there around there then, but I got the aftermath. I came way after. But he was still in that condition, never able to get back into that world, to reach his potential, to be the brilliant talent that could have put together the Black Panther. And only late in life, when I was grown, were there Black magazines that allowed him to come back. Way after we had spent a time when he had to find all which-a-way positions just to support his family. Do it in their name. I'm doing it in his name, in the name of so many others who could not reach what they deserved to reach because they were labeled by the history of slavery and the time that they lived. Dr. Daniels, I cannot thank you enough for the monumental work that you've done. I hope I've not gone too much over time, but I hope that it is, in fact, a message that will have us light-footed, strong of spirit. We'll look up and say, Lord, lift us up where the eagles fly. Lord, lift us up. Take those wings and let's go to work. God bless all of you. God bless the work you have done. God bless the United States of America. Thank you. I need your help.
Let's give it up again for the Honorable Sheila Jackson Lee. Let's give it up. Jeff, please come up. Want to acknowledge Malik Zulu Sabaz with the New Black Panther Party. Give it up for them. On the front, on the battlefield, Mark Thompson, Make It Plain, out there on the battlefield. Don Rojas, one of the great warriors of this struggle out here. And so as we conclude, we're all together. Perhaps we can all do a harambe together in the African tradition. Let's all pull together. Jeff, is that all right? Can we do that? Any final words from you, Jeff?
No. My final words are, my manners are to thank this great historic church for opening its doors. When I first got to the United States Congress, I came to this place to have a ceremonial swearing in. And I will never forget that every time you ask, this historic church opens its doors. We are blessed to have them. Thank you. And to all of those, Dr. Malveaux, thank you. You were powerful. You have struck a chord that is going to be listened to. Brother Coach and others, they have struck a chord. Thank you.
All right, stay here. All right, Hillary, some of the members of the commission, come on. Come on, Nana, those four on the panel, Dr.
Be careful coming up.
Help them up. All right, we're just going to do 7 harambes, okay? Is that all right with everybody? We're going to do them real quickly. 1, 2, hold your hands up. 1, 2, 3, and 7 times. Hold the last one as long as I do. 1, 2, 3. Harambe, 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 Harambe. All right, glorious day.